Hello and good evening. Tonight's gentle journey takes us to the haunted walk of Arakai. Lower the volume, rest your eyes, and let the past be your lullaby. If this brings you peace, consider liking and subscribing only if it truly helps. And share in the comments where you're joining us from. And the hour there, now. Lights down. A soft fan if you have one. And let's begin our walk through history. The warhammer touched a stone with a tired clang that sighed down the corridor like the dungeon itself was exhaling. Nicholas Highforge slid to the floor beside it, the rough wall grating the plates of his espalder as he sank, and rubbed at his wrists where the vambraces had bitten deep. Purple would bloom there by morning, thumbprints of labor stamped by the day. He leaned his head back until the helm rang softly against rock. Should have become a bard, he murmured, with a half laugh that hurt. Like my sister, songs, warm taverns, easy smiles, no rats the size of toddlers and goblins debating theology with a pumpkin. Debating theology, he says. Jericho replied, crouched nearby with the liquid economy of a stagehand who knows where every nail lives. She drew a cloth across her twin daggers. Green streaks came away and darkened to brown. The torchlight pulled copper sheen from her crimson skin and traced the charcoal whorls that climbed her forearms marks that civilians called tattoos and she called history. Her horns followed the bones of her skull back and up, polished to a storm's gleam. A chain of lockpicks chimed together as she shifted, a jewelry of bad decisions and narrow escapes. Her tail, restless, flicked at a puddle of dungeon mystery and wisely missed. They were worshipping a gourd. Nicholas, a crowned gourd. I've seen cults with more coherent doctrine. A very fine gourd. Bink Burnside declared he had claimed an overturned crate like a throne, a gnome of cheerful disarray with chalk smudged on his sleeves, and a satchel that never yielded the same ingredient twice. He peered into the satchel now, nose wrinkled in concentration. Specimen like that doesn't grow every season. Old Mossbach must pamper his soil like a priest with relics. Deep mulch, ash, compost, and a moonlit chant or two. Ah, he brightened, waggled two ink-stained fingers, and whispered a trick of syllables that smelled faintly of cinnamon. 2 butter cookies popped from the air while still deciding what shape to be. Settling into rounds that steamed in the cold, he broke and offered arcane thermodynamics. Jericho, conjuration must obey conservation. If I could bake you a banquet for a cantrip, I would. The butter alone would bankrupt the weave. Jericho caught her portion with her tail, an infuriatingly graceful habit Nicholas pretended not to admire. With all respect to your equations, she said around a bite, you conjure deliciously. Bink? But your portions are a crime, immutable law, not a stinginess. Bink pushed up his spectacles with a knuckle smudged in chalk, then took a small, cautious nibble, as if grading his own enchantment. Though I did nudge the sugar upward by never mind, acceptable crumb. Cookie warmth settled in Nicholas's palm like a hearth he could hold. He chewed, and the ache behind his eyes eased, though nothing else did. He looked around the chamber, their battlefield, their chapel, their kitchen by necessity. The dungeon was the kind that smelled of old water and iron, the sort of smell that married itself to leather and followed you for days. Goblin idols twisted from stolen farm tools and adorned with twine and crow feathers leaned drunkenly against walls. Somewhere deeper in the warren, A cook fire still whispered over embers, whispering what they all preferred not to identify. It was easier not to imagine the menu, and in the room the goblins had consecrated as a shrine. The cause of it all sat like a smug monarch on a dais of crates and woolly blankets, old mossbox prize pumpkin, the size of a beer barrel and twice as proud. They had ringed it with offerings shiny pebbles, knotted a string, and a disturbing congregation of left boots, and crowned it with a circlet bent from spoons. The torch behind it burned low, painting the rind in a sleepy amber. For a heartbeat, it really did look like a king. Nicholas let out a long breath and tried to unknot the belief that he had made the world better by being here. The Justicar's sunburst on his tabard was a brown smudge under dungeon grime. Once, that emblem had won him instant trust at farm gates. Villagers would step aside with grateful looks, and mutters of the light be praised. Lately, it mostly bought him requests no purse could honor. This is the work, the instructors used to say. Protect the small. No one mentioned how frequently the small didn't have coin. He watched Jericho peel back her hair from her forehead with gloved fingers and tuck it beneath a leather thong, saw the set to her jaw that said she had a plan he wouldn't love. He watched Bink watch the world, eyes at once kindly and hungry, as if the cave itself were a problem that could be solved with the right ghost of wonder. These were the two people Nicholas trusted to wake him in the night and keep watch while he slept. He had bled for them and with them, and he would again, but he could not feed them on honor. Jericho flicked a glance toward the pumpkin. We take the royal squash home. We collect our paltry hero's fee, and we try not to throttle the bailiff when he frowns, like the coins are his ribs. Paltry is prejudicial language, Bink said. Sliding off his crate to pad closer to the altar, he laced his fingers behind his back like a scholar studying a rare text. We don't know the exact sum. It could be entirely predictable. That's worse, Jericho muttered. Nicholas pushed himself upright and reached for the hammer again, cradling its haft like a staff. His legs complained. So did his conscience on cue. As always about Jericho's extracurricular income and Bink's mild disregard for guild rules around foodcraft. He had once believed morality was a ladder climb, it rung by rung, and you get to the roof. Traveling had taught him it was more like a rope bridge over foggy depths. You held the lines. You moved forward. You didn't look down too long. Bards don't bruise like this, he said, rotating one shoulder until something clicked back into place with a muffled pop. Bards bruise all the time, Jericho said. They just write better choruses about it. Bink sighed contentedly at his cookie round's perfection, and then, because he could not help himself, held it up to the torchlight. Studying the way the greenish flame lacquered the sugar, do you suppose? He mused. The goblins tried to talk to the pumpkin like a saint's skull. They might have believed a harvest spirit dwelt in its pulp. There's a sweet superstition all through the villages that if you carve a candle in a gourd and set it by the road, wandering things consider your home already claimed and pass by. I wouldn't put complex theology past them, simple theology. Certainly, Jericho sheathed one dagger, then the other blades kissing scabbard with a professional hush. They also tried to stab us with the spoons, she said. So let's not overcredit the congregation. Nicholas crossed to the shrine and brushed the bent spoon crown with his gauntlet. It clinked against rind with a hollow, comic dignity. The pumpkin did not answer his apology to it. He found himself smiling. Despite it all, right, we get his rotund majesty home, then sleep, tomorrow, armor mended, coin counted, bruises compared, tomorrow, Bink echoed. But the word hung thinner than he'd meant it to. It wasn't only his exhaustion, it was the arithmetic they kept not doing aloud. Room rent at the guild annex, oil, rations, sharpening, hose, mending, potions for the days when prayer didn't move fast enough. Tomorrow had a way of arriving with its hand out. Nicholas glanced again at the Justicar sunburst, at the scoring across it from the chieftain's poisoned knife. 2 near deaths in a day for what? A handful of metal in a sack. He had sworn oaths with both hands on a sanctified text, and he still believed in them. But belief did not buy mutton. He imagined his sister on a tavern table 2 towns over, telling the same story in the warm, easy past tense, passing a hat that filled faster than their purse ever did. You're thinking too loudly, Jericho said. Softer now? When the battle finished, her voice often lost its edge and gained something like concern, though she'd deny it till dawn. I know that look. The one where you go inside your armor and weld the seams shut. Occupational hazard, Nicholas said. Occupational underpayment, she corrected. Her tail traced an idle S in the dirt. We've been paid in thanks, so often the word is wearing out. Bink patted the pumpkin as if it were a faithful hound. He was incapable of not comforting things. Well, he said, let's move a future festival centerpiece before someone's cousin returns with sharper spoons. He blinked at the crown again. Amused? Do goblins have cousins? Of course they do. Jericho? Don't bother answering. Everything has cousins, even pumpkins, if you count varieties. Nicholas bent to the altar, wedged his hands under the gourd's belly, and tested its weight. Wheelbarrow, he said, with reverence for the noblest of inventions. There was one near the entrance, half broken and squealing like a boar. It will do. Jericho rose in a single fluid line and rolled her shoulders as if a new game had begun. I'll scout the first bend, she said. Clear the path of any last surprises. Not that there are any left, she added to soothe his paladin's worries then, leading with a grin that meant mischief tomorrow and professionalism tonight. She vanished into the murk with a whisper of picks. Bink lifted his staff. The top bead flared a mild, friendly blue. Its light laid soft edges on the cavern and made every damp seam of quartz wink. He touched a sigil in the air, and one after another the torches steadied, as if standing straighter for inspection. I can color shift these, he mused idly, more to himself than to them. Make the stones sing, make shadows. Never mind, not a problem for today. Not today. Nicholas breathed once more, deep and slow, and felt the bruise in his rib complain like an old relative. He hauled, Bink guided. Jericho's hand sign flashed from the corridor mouth, clear. The 3 of them eased the pumpkin down from its throne of blankets and lifted together, adjusting grip, sliding, bumping, laughing once when a bent spoon fell and rang off his greave like a tiny bell blessing the endeavor. In the doorway, Nicholas paused and looked back at the unholy chapel they had dismantled by inches. Broken standards, snuffed fire, a poor shrine made by poor hands. He was not sentimental about goblins. They had tried earnestly to kill him. But even an enemy's devotion looked like need up close. He had a sudden, absurd thought that there had to be a better way to earn one's keep than trading fresh bruises for thin purses in rooms like this. The thought didn't feel like treason. It felt like mercy for them, for himself, for the way a village sleeps easier when peril becomes a story rather than a headline on the door. He didn't have the shape of the better way yet, only the ache and the sense that the next quest might not involve a map at all. "Come on, paladin," Jericho called softly from the hall, her voice a ribbon in the dark. "Let's take a king home." Nicholas set his shoulder to the weight and moved. They found the wheelbarrow half buried in leaf litter near the cave mouth. One handle wrapped with a strip of rag and the wheel wobbling on a peg that had seen better carpenters. Nicholas tested the grips, winced at the grind in his shoulders, and with Jericho bracing the rim and Bink chanting a small corrections to friction and balance, they eased the pumpkin into the barrow's shallow cradle. The bent spoon crown they saved Jericho hung it on the side like a trophy from a strange tourney. The barrow complained with each lurch, metal squeaking like a mouse choir. Trees shouldered close, their branches knitting a ceiling of late autumn gold. The woods of Arakai liked to pretend they were older than time, and in November light they nearly managed it. The path corkscrewed through beech and oak, whose roots heaved up the soil in great knuckles. The leaf fall had gone to a crisp bronze that cracked like glacier sugar underfoot, and a cold sap smell rose when their boots broke them. Someone had hung a string of harvest charms, bundles of grain, a polished stone with a drilled eye between two saplings. The charms clicked as the wind moved. The oldest kind of ward. Bink kept to the high side of the wheel to prevent a disastrous tip. Jericho walked backward at times, eyes on the pumpkin as if it were a noble under escort. "Left here," she said, flicking her tail toward a narrow bend choked with fern. "You'll catch on that route otherwise." Nicholas leaned into the handles. The thin iron of the wheel rasped against a stone. He counted the rhythm. Breathe, push, breathe as the forest counted with him, woodpecker tapping, distant crow. He told himself to be grateful for the cold that came in under his gorget and quieted the ache for a while. If you were born to field work, late autumn meant the ledger between hunger and plenty was being written in barns and bins. If you were born to the road, it meant every mile felt longer in the joints. The trees broke at last, and the land opened into winter-stubbled fields, down curving to a creek that drew a bright line around the village. Milhaven stood there, fewer than 50 roofs gathered around a square, and a single bell tower that the wind loved to ring. Smoke drifted in the slack evening from a dozen chimneys. A farmer on a cart is slow to watch them pass. Nicholas caught the way the man's mouth rounded at their very literal spoils of war, then shaped into a grin. News travels between hedges faster than any courier. By the time they creaked into the square, there was a knot of villagers waiting. "Me pumpkin," old Mossbach cried, and ran faster than a man with that much beard usually can. His hands were cracked from a life that measures itself in sewings and liftings. When he folded them around the broad orange flank, he wept outright. "My beautiful girl," he murmured to the rind, to the three of them, to the maker. There are tears that demand a hush from a crowd. These did. For a breath or 5, no one spoke. Even Jericho, who could out-talk a market, held still. Then came claps and shoulder slaps and a scatter of well done s, and after that came the purse. Bailiff Hendrik Bramble was a man who had perfected the art of appearing inconvenienced by the existence of others. He wore his office like a collar, a size too tight. He produced a small leather bag, weighed it in his palm as if reluctant to learn its contents, and opened it with a little mouth of discomfort. Nicholas put out a gauntleted hand. Hendrik tipped the coins in. They sounded like truth when they hit 5 gold, 8 silver, copper to fill a tooth. That, Jericho said after a silence in which Nicholas counted twice in sheer hope, is comedy. That, Hendrik said with bureaucratic dignity, is the agreed amount for the clearing of 1 goblin den and the retrieval of 1 agricultural item of note, as posted upon the board. You will recall I specified not to exceed 2 days' labor at guild rates. Bink recited, helpful as a hymn book. Hendrik snapped the purse shut. Precisely. We thank you for your service. The Harvest Prizes Parade proceeds at dusk 2 weeks hence. Good evening. He turned away with the air of a man who had just paid an invoice for kerosene. Nicholas parceled the money on instinct, 1 gold and some silver each. Copper fanned like autumn maples, then skimmed the remainder into the kit purse they kept for unglamorous cost as rivets, waxed thread, oil, the day Jericho's boot soul parted company with her life choices. The clink felt small against the square's open air. He remembered a temple homily about fishes and loaves, and smiled without humor at the thought of multiplying coins by blessing alone. Cracked flagon, Jericho said, as if naming a sanctuary. Cracked flagon, Nicholas agreed, because there are days when righteousness must be served with a stew. The flagon made it easy to forgive a world. Its timbers remembered ship masts. Its floorboards sang when you walked them. A split wooden tankard hung over the hearth, the inn's namesake, cleaved decades ago in some legendary brawl and lacquered ever since like a sacred wound. Goethe Stone Mill kept counsel behind the bar with 4 arms that could out-wrestle old gods and a soft spot for estrays. There you are, she said, catching sight of them. 3 plates. No argument? Sit. They took a corner table near the kitchen, heat from the big fire finding the chill in Nicholas's bones and drawing it out finger by finger. The room was the early evening version of full children, too drowsy to misbehave, old men with their last daylight story, young couples passing the day's gossip across the table like a warmed roll, a fiddler tuned without committing to a song. From somewhere in the back, a dog sneezed in its sleep. Stew, Nicholas said, when Goethe's eyebrow asked, thick as you can do it. Fish pie, Jericho said, and something green enough that Nicholas can lecture me about nutrition. Vegetables, Bink said. Bright, whatever's roasted, and if you've any cider you aren't saving for counselors with hats. Goethe's mouth quirked. Sorry to report my cider respects no hats, she said, and went away to shout commands that doubled as endearments. They sat. The quiet that follows coin counting is a thin one. Nicholas spun his single gold on the tabletop, watched the fire catch in it each time it flashed. If the guild annex wanted rent next week, and it did, they would manage it by calling in every favor owed and leaving their armor laces 1 fray from breaking. He felt the lecture rise in him, the one about Jericho's hands and other people's purses, about trust as a public good, and the way a town cracks when it can't assume its coin is safe. He swallowed it with the first spoon of stew. It was exactly the kind his mother had made on winter Sundays, barley and root. Bay, and the mild miracle that happens when a bone has the patience to give itself up to broth. He ate with the steady focus of a man who knew not to waste warmth. Across from him, Jericho coaxed a coin from behind Bink's ear and let it vanish into her palm with a flourish she couldn't quite resist. "Return it," Nicholas said. "Without looking up, I would never." Jericho said then, more softly, to someone who needs it, "There is a season every year when villages pull their belts in 2 notches and call it sensibility. After the fields are brought and tithed, after the miller takes his due and the temple lifts its candle tax, after the reeve has done his sums and the bailiff has counted his beans, households look at their tables and try to stretch festivals from salt pork and dried apples. The year's harvest had been fair but not rich. A goblin month had strained the cart trails and nicked the traders' schedules. Men like Hendrik do not call it a stinginess when they clutch a purse. They call it a stewardship. They imagine the faces that will be in their doorway come frost widows, fathers with hat in hands, and decide that adventurers are less likely to starve. Goethe landed plates with a grace that disguised the weight Nicholas's bowl thick enough to stand a spoon in. Jericho's pie splitting the steam that smelled of dill and smoke, Bink's mound of carrots, parsnips, and onion glazed to a sheen. "Cider," she said, setting 3 cups. "And a question is the rumor about Musbach's gourd true, or only half so true," Bink said, warming his hands over his vegetables. A tiny blue flame danced along his forefinger, a cantrip to keep supper honest until the last bite. "And heavier than our regrets." Goethe laughed in her chest. "Then you'll let me buy your rooms for the night," she said. "Call it a tavern keeper's tithe for bringing home the village's dignity." She tipped the wink of a conspirator and moved on, leaving behind a line of glow only she could write in air. Jericho watched her go with an expression Nicholas recognized, the one she got when she found softness where she'd braced for hardness. She pinched a sprig of greens between finger and thumb, held it up like an herb used for augury. "It would be so much easier," she said to the sprig, "to steal from people I dislike. Do not try to be ethical via vegetable," Nicholas said. And Jericho laughed because she couldn't help it. Bink prodded a carrot with the intensity he usually assigned to sigils. "Our guild room," he said after a while, noodling the air where arithmetic lived. "Rent next week. Oil now. I can stretch candles by 10% if I reuse wick stubs." But even so, the blue flame on his finger guttered. "Flared again? We need income that doesn't fling knives at us. We've tried escorting caravans," Jericho said. "The boredom alone nearly killed me. We could sell spell work," Bink said. "Enchantments, repairs, performances." He glanced vaguely at Nicholas. "Moral consulting." Nicholas snorted. "We don't pay rent with opinions." He lifted the spoon again, let the stew steady him. Around them, the room had swollen pleasantly. Toward evening, the fiddler had picked a tune everyone knew. The dog had decided on another nap. A card game formed where the light was best. The inn was a parish of the unchurched, a place where the liturgy ran on mugs and murmurs and the breaking of pies. He tried to imagine a life built here, the 3 of them, doing this very work without a goblin in sight, and failed. The road lives in your gait once you've walked it this long. Jericho's hand appeared near his bowl and removed one of his rolls with insolent grace. Consider it a tax, she said, levied by the office of keeping you from sulking yourself to death. Unrecognized authority, Nicholas said, and Estelle let her take it. At the next table, a pair of farmers debated All Hallows plans with deeply respectable dread. Pumpkin carving in the square. One said, apple bobbing, the usual, riveting. The other deadpanned, I'll bring my yawns. Nicholas's coin, still spinning, wobbled toward collapse. He set a finger on it and stopped its clatter. In the hollow between one thought and the next, something like a wish rose in him that the people who gave them thin purses could, for an hour, feel what the three of them felt when the cave closed around them and the work turned sharp. Maybe then the village would count risk differently. He didn't say it aloud. It wasn't a plan, only an ache. Bink's blue flame licked the edge of a carrot. We'll think of something, he said. The way people say when they are trying not to be the one who admits the ledger doesn't balance. Nicholas looked around at the flagon, at Goethe's easy authority, at the fiddler's careful bow, at the flour still dusting a baker's sleeve, at the way neighbors watched each other without seeming to. The inn was a ledger, too, one the whole town balanced together, laughter in, safety out. He took another spoon of his stew and let its warmth propose that another kind of courage might exist than the kind he wore on his chest. Outside, the bell tower hummed to itself once. A draft found the back of his neck and announced the first real cold coming. He set his spoon down, rubbed his wrists again where purple would be, and told himself there had to be a better way to be brave than waiting for the next thin purse in the next cold square. The flagon breathed around them like a living thing, hops and hearth. The low tide of talk ebbing and rising, the fiddle slipping into a tune everyone knew. At the bar, old Mossbach was already retelling the rescue with embellishments that grew like ivy. Centerpiece of All Hallows, he declared, voice buoyant with ale and relief. We'll set her up in the square. Candles inside, big carving, proper spectacle. Two farmers leaned in, elbows parked and faces politely grim. Apple bobbing, one said, as if naming a chore. And the lantern walk, I suppose? The other nodded, the way men nod at weather they can't change. Jericho, elbow draped over her chair in a posture of rakish indifference, wrinkled her nose. Apple bobbing is how you waterboard yourself for a sugared sphere, she murmured. Eyes on the farmers? Scariest part is the mildew in the tub. She pinched a crumb from the table and flicked it at Nicholas. Tell me you're not satisfied with a harvest festival whose signature threat is damp hair. Nicholas didn't answer. His gold piece had found its orbit again, a sun for a tiny system of thought, and he watched it whirl through firelight and shadow. He was tired to the root, and in the way of exhaustion. His mind chewed a single idea until it frayed. If the village understood what they'd just done, if they felt the corridor squeeze around their shoulders, heard the scrape of a poisoned blade on plate, tasted the dry copper moment right before a trap conceded. You'd outwitted this. Would they measure adventuring by a different ledger? Would a purse open wider if fear had been a first-hand language? He didn't want revenge or even fairness as coins. He wanted recognition in a form that could also pay for bread. Bink's vegetables had gone cool at the edges. He coaxed them back with a neat globe of blue fire at his fingertip. And then the thought, some astray equation, unspooling into a realization, lit his whole face. "That's it," he said, and brought his little sphere down on the table with more enthusiasm than sense. The flame jumped a hand's breadth higher with a sharp crack. A nearby blacksmith torment, who believed the world was forever trying to collide with his shirt, jerked, and slopped ale down the front of his chest. "You little spark hazard," he thundered, dabbing uselessly at himself with the hem of his apron. "Put your fireworks somewhere sensible." "Mortified?" Bink said. "Not mortified at all." The flame winked out. The idea did not. He was glowing with it now in the way he glowed only when spells behaved perfectly, or the cosmos offered him a riddle he knew he could solve. "No training the whole town how to parry," he said, words tumbling. "No. Let them borrow the feeling. For one evening, safely." Jericho put her boots up on the rung of Nicholas's chair, a signal that the performance would continue, but the skeptic was readying tomatoes. "Borrow the feeling," how she asked. "Hire a troupe to chase them with turnips. You're either about to rent costumes or risk our insurance premiums." Bink spread his hands, palms up, the way magicians do in the beat before a dove appears. We turned the dungeon into a haunted walk. The table sat, with that, for a breath. Behind them, Mossbach told one of his favorite parts how the bent spoons made a crown worthy of a gourd king, and people laughed in the way people do when they've survived something together. "A haunted walk," Nicholas repeated slowly, as if sounding the syllables for hidden edges, as in, we invite the entire village to return to the place we nearly died, and we make it entertaining, as in, we scaffold the experience. Bink said, words bright and brittle with excitement. "We already have the stage, caves and corridors. We mark a path, one path, and we build the night on it. Fog at the mouth, so you taste the cold on your tongue. Torches that stain the stone green. Whispers from the walls, harmless traps, timed reveals, illusions that stop a heart for a beat and then give it back. A guardian statue that moves when you think it cannot." His eyes slid to Nicholas's shoulders and then back. Delighted. "You, still as a prayer until you're not." Jericho hooked a fingertip through the handle of her cider and spun the cup. "Considering, last time you had an idea you called harmless. We met a gelatinous cube in a storm drain. I lost boots I loved. Bink. Leather dissolved like a soap bubble. I sang a lament for those boots. That was one time," he protested with heartbreaking sincerity. "And you learned a valuable thing about Uzis." "I learned grief," Jericho said dryly. Bink leaned forward so far his chin nearly touched the table. "There's a season for this, Jericho. This exact season. When fields are put to bed and nights arrive early. People have always made a little theater out of fear geysers, mummers, bonfires, and masks. We're not inventing appetite. We're offering a finer kitchen." He ticked off counters on his fingers. "You know traps like a composer knows silence. I can layer sound and light until even the hearth-stubborn flinch. Nicholas can be every story they were told as children about knights who do not blink. And we do it with rules and ropes and exits. No harm. Awe, yes. But the kind you laugh at when you hold each other in the square afterward and say, 'Did you see?' Nicholas saw two things at once: the corridor with its breath-held hush, right before he struck a shield to hammer, and the faces of the people leaving the square in a glow lanterns. Laughter, dares made and kept. Apple bobbing had its place, so did a thrill carefully measured like a spice. In his training, they told him terror corrupts and delight distracts. He had come to suspect both could also heal, if carefully prepared, charging admission, he said, because the justicar in him would not let the practical slide. That's the point, isn't it? We stand at the mouth with a box for coins. It is not the only point, Bink said. And then, more honestly, but it is also the point. We're broke. Jericho cut in before Nicholas's conscience could clear its throat. Safety first, she said crisply. You're no good at all if a child's wrist gets sprained in a net or a torch throws ember. If we build this, we overbuild the safeguards, padding, spotters, and we space groups so nobody turns a scare into a trampling. I will design the flow like a shrine procession. Bink said at once. One party enters, one party exits, never two at the same turn. I'll mark torches for the route and charm a few stones to moan at the right places. Triggers is set for proximity, not pressure, so we never risk someone catching a foot. Jericho sipped, eyes narrowing as the map wrote itself onto the walls in her mind. I could rig a tripwire that startles instead of snags, drop a ghost net that looks convincing, lands like a veil, false floors that tilt to pillows, and I'll mark myself hiding places, crevices for a whisper, ledges for a drop. People always fear the breath they didn't expect on the back of their neck. She smiled in a manner that would have won the devotion of any self-respecting imp. Harmless, paladin. I promise. It'll feel dangerous the way an argument feels before you remember you love the person. Nicholas felt the push-pull he always felt in moments when the world asked him to be more flexible than the academy had. He sifted the idea for transgression and found none he could defend with a straight face, no mockery of holy things, no exploitation of grief, just theater constructed from the exact wood they'd just chopped dread and release, darkness and torch. He suspected his goddess, who knew something about processions and transformation, might not object. We'd need rules, he said, and caught himself already in, spoken at the door and again in the first chamber. Stay with your group. No touching the exhibits. If you panic, you step left and follow the red marks out, and we cap entries so no one gets crushed by our success. Bink's grin was all childhood and mischief. Now you're talking like a producer at the bar. Goethe leaned in to hear something Mossbach whispered, and then barked a laugh that turned heads for the joy of it. A fresh gust shouldered the door. Leaves scudded across the threshold, bringing with them the crisp smell of the season's edge. Nicholas listened to the village breathe. It sounded, for once, like a place that wanted a new story to tell about itself tomorrow. Suppose, Jericho said, thumb-rubbing condensation from her cup. The bailiff snarls about permits. We ask forgiveness after we've filled his square with paying pilgrims. Bink said serenely, and we build so well, even his frown feels like endorsement. Nicholas tapped his coin once in the center of the table and left it there flat. Decision stilled. We do no real harm, he said. We don't sell fear to people who can't afford it. We price it fair. And we save space for those who want to watch without walking. Jericho glanced at the room, at the teenage knot by the fire, daring each other to butter their noses, at the elders pretending not to plan how close they would stand to a grandchild when the lantern walk came. at the bailiff himself in a corner mumbling over a ledger while his second tried to teach him to smile. Price it fair, she echoed. I can live with that. Bink sat back, hands clasped as if he'd just concluded a lesson and was delighted by his pupils. Then say it, he said, the blue spark returning, small and polite this time, dancing in the bowl of his palm, so I can begin drawing diagrams on a napkin, which is where all great civic projects are truly born. Nicholas looked from one friend to the other, counted out the risks on an inner abacus, and found that wonder weighed more than worry tonight. He lifted his cider. We build a haunted walk, he said, and the words felt like a door opening. We let Milhaven feel brave for an evening. They touched cups to seal it, a quiet clink under the talk song of the room. Outside, the wind chased leaves up the square and then let them go, and inside, 3 people who had thought their profession was only blood and blade leaned together over an emptying table and began to trade in a different currency ideas. They cleared a corner of the table the way carpenters clear a bench quietly, with intent, and Bink flattened a napkin like parchment before a magistrate. He produced a nub of charcoal from a pocket that had previously contained time, a copper hinge, and something that mewed once and was never seen again. First, he said, with a schoolmaster's optimism, we price the feeling. Jericho leaned in, her chin propped on a fist, the coin she'd borrowed from Nicholas traveling through her fingers like a fish that didn't wish to be caught. Nicholas watched the 2 of them the way a road-worn officer watches 2 bright recruits hatch a plan wary. Warmed against his will, the flagon's air smelled of roasted onions and a spilled cider. The ball in the square tolled once as if to mark the opening of their enterprise. Assume, Bink went on, drawing a box that became a very respectable cave mouth. That half the village will come. That's conservative. Curiosity is a sin and a civic virtue. 20 households. He sketched little squares for houses that looked suspiciously like biscuits. Call it 4 souls each on average. More if the cousins come in from the lanes, Jericho said. But count 4. Better to be pleasantly wrong. 80 visitors, Bink said, and made a ladder of marks. At 2 gold per Nicholas blinked. 2 Bink met his look without flinching. You may translate that into a fair price for safety, design, and expertise, if your conscience prefers. We can lower for children, widows, and anyone who looks at me with a gaze that says, my purse is a moth museum, but if we call the work cheap, they'll treat it like trinkets. Jericho twirled the coin, thinking that over. There are economies she trusts, the black market's hard arithmetic, the market square's softer kind. 2, she said at last, but we never refuse someone who can't pay if they've walked all the way from the far fields just to stand at the mouth and be brave. I'll know who's who. Nicholas exhaled through his nose, relenting. We can set a donation bowl at the exit for those who want to give because they laughed too loud. He was trying on this new coat and finding the fit not terrible. All right. 2, 160 gold for a single evening. Bink finished, tapping the napkin as if to conjure the coins into the room by percussion alone. The number lay between them and glowed. And we have the bones already, caves, corridors, atmosphere. We add the sinew light, sound, timing, and wrap it in skin rules. Rules first, Nicholas said, because some habits are vows at the door. We tell them what they need to stay whole. They enter in a small parties, 4 to 6. No torches of their own, we light the way. No touching the displays or performers. If anyone feels faint or frightened, there's an exit marked in red chalk. Left-hand wall, no running. He glanced toward the hearth as if his goddess could nod from the flames, and we put cushions anywhere we expect to stumble, and a spotters, Jericho added, already mapping bodies in the dark. I can station a couple of the older lads from the guild by the tight bends and the last chamber. If they see a crush starting, they hold the next group. We need rope barriers subtle, but enough to suggest the path, funnel the flow. Bink drew ropes on his napkin that looked like garlands on a festival float. Spacing. He said, we release one group, let them reach the third torch, then the next. That gives each party the luxury of believing the cave belongs to them. Fear doesn't work in a crowd. It works in the space between a breath and the next step. Nicholas nodded, despite himself, and fire precautions. He touched his thumb to the rim of his cider, an unconscious blessing. No open flames near the net drops. Torches set high in brackets. Ash buckets beneath. I'll borrow 2 woolen blankets from Goethe for a smothering if needed. Signage, Bink said, writing it in careful block letters as if the napkin would submit itself to a printer. A board at the mouth. Stay with your group. Follow the lit path. Do not touch the exhibits. If you wish to leave early, step to the left and follow the red marks back out. Simple words. People can hold simple words even when their heart does a small drum solo. Jericho's tail made a lazy S. Now the art. She said, my part scares that feel like teeth and are actually gums. Trip wires that give noise without catching ankle. A brass bell on a thread you only notice when it sinks. A net that drops with a whisper and kisses shoulders, not throats. False floors that tilt 1 inch, just enough to tell the body it doesn't own the earth. And I'll seed hides for myself where a whisper will do more than a shout. Overhead ledges, curtain slits. The back of a neck is an instrument. Bink clapped his hands softly, delighted, and mine light and sound. We've got torch brackets throughout. I'll charm the flames to cycle from gold to a queasy green. Maybe a violet that makes shadows look more alive than they are. Continual flame with a color shift bound to a time seam. It'll hold for weeks. He drew a series of little torches, like a score. I'll enchant a stones at knee height to groan when someone passes. Stone remembers when you ask it politely. A single spectral figure in a long corridor, silent as scream. Vanish and a floating weapon at an intersection, just out of reach. He looked toward Nicholas and smiled. And one living statue that only reveals life when a group is close enough to smell the oil in your mail. The paladin's mouth moved in a reluctant smile. I can paint sigils, he said, surprising himself with how eager he felt to do it. Not true words, no deceit of the sacred, but the shapes the faithful know, inverted and distressed, the way abandoned chapels look when ivy wins. They'll glow with a sickly light. People will not read words, they'll read feeling. If I stand in an alcove ceremonial plate, warhammer held like a staff, head bent and then lift at the right beat. He raised the hammer a fraction in the air to feel the weight of the moment. The room's buzz fell away in his imagination until he heard only a group's breath and a scrape of his greave. They'll run, and they'll laugh while they run. Pacing, Bink said again. A conductor now, we cut the dungeon into beats. Fog at the mouth disorientation. But safe, first color shift wonder, sound skepticism cracks, the net laughter, a shriek that breaks tension, armors that turn their heads dread, your reveal impact, finale in the shrine chamber, the great eye opens and sees them release through the exit into night air where their bodies tell them they survived, so they deserve cider. Jericho thumped her finger once on the table and will need a front of house, someone to greet, recite rules, soothe the skittish, and hold the coin chest with a smile that says, "This is worth what you're about to feel." Bink raised his hand. "Me? Obviously. I will be the master of ceremonies and mild warnings." He pitched his voice into an ominous hush that made a boy at the next table turn his head. "Welcome, welcome. Follow the flame. Do not stray. Some things may touch you. Nothing will keep you." He grinned, back to himself. "Plus, I'm small. People ignore what's below their eye line until it speaks. And the chest," Nicholas said. "We need change, silver and copper enough to soften the price for families. We keep a ledger, Jericho. You count with him at intervals so no one can say we palmed coins. Transparency is armor." Jericho saluted with 2 fingers and a smirk. "I love when honesty doubles as a strategy." Bink's charcoal had now filled the napkin with arrows and tiny people and something that might have been a ghost if ghosts wore hats. He sat back at last, considering their plan the way a mason considers a wall from a little distance, chin tilted, making it whole in his head. "We'll advertise," he said. More to himself than to them, text must be simple and tempting. The haunted walk of Arakai, a night of scares and adventure. If you dare, date, hour, price, directions, follow the torches into the wood, and a gentle warning, not recommended for the faint of heart, which, paradoxically, invites the faint of heart most of all. "Posters," Jericho said, her gaze gone fox bright. "On the board, by the well, at the flagon, at the smithy, the apothecary, the temple door, if Nicholas can stomach it. I know a printer," she said it like someone saying. "I know a locksmith. He owes me, let's call it a favor rather than a debt." For politeness, Nicholas had learned which questions to ask and which to leave in the drawer. He lifted an eyebrow only slightly. "We'll need a stack, not a handful. I can have you 200 by noon tomorrow if I press hard enough," she said, very sure, and then softened it for his conscience. "Paid for. Nicholas, properly, if the price bites, I'll bite back with negotiation. Not theft. A traveling merchant leaves at dawn for the next town. I can slide a dozen into his cart with a charm and a smile." Bink nodded, back in arithmetic. "Word travels along roads. Yes, but faster along mouths. Goethe will be our herald. She'll tell every soul who crosses that threshold that the bravest will meet themselves by torchlight. The guilds will grumble and then go. The children will hear a word like forbidden and lean toward it like plants to sun." Nicholas looked past their table to the people who would become customers, or pilgrims, or both. A spectacle is a village's way of reminding itself it's a village. Bodies shoulder to shoulder. Fear measured and survived. Talk for mornings after. He'd seen bounties bring in coin. Sometimes he'd never seen them bring in laughter that lasted through winter. "We're not just selling fright," he said, trying the sentence on his tongue. were selling the story they tell themselves afterward that they were braver than they thought. And together, Jericho's mouth tilted, and were selling them the pleasure of screaming at their own neighbors without apology. That too, Nicholas conceded. Bink folded the napkin with ceremonial care and slid it into his sleeve. Tomorrow, he said, with the dangerous serenity of a man who has decided something and will now bend the day to it, Jericho, persuade your printer. I'll refine the torch enchantments on paper and work out the trigger intervals. Nicholas, write the rules in words so plain even Tormund can understand them on the first go. And sleep, the kind where you mean it. Nicholas lifted his cup again. His arm ached less, or perhaps hope had muddied the river of hurt. We do no harm, he said once more, for himself, for the goddess who listened, for the village that would trust them. We do this like we're building a bridge and our own children have to cross it. Jericho tapped his cup with hers, and we make it unforgettable, she said, because some vows are not written in temples. Bink's eyes had the shine of a lamp newly trimmed. Unforgettable, he echoed, and profitable. They laughed. 3 notes braided, and for the first time that day, the future didn't feel like a corridor that narrowed. It felt like a square full of lanterns, the hum of a crowd carrying itself into winter, and a string of torches winding into the woods, where a village would go to practice courage together and come back with cheeks red from cold and embarrassment and joy. Outside, the wind shouldered the door again, and a scatter of leaves skittered across the floorboards. As if the season itself wanted in on the plan, dawn came in thin pewter, the kind of light that makes even hopeful plans look like they've been left out in the rain. They met on the cobbles outside Aldous Finch's print shop, a narrow wedge of a building shouldered between the apothecary and the cobbler, its window fogged with the breath of ink. Jericho went in alone. Nicholas watched through the glass as she leaned across the counter, her posture the cat-like slouch of someone who knows precisely where the pressure points are. Words passed between her and Aldous in a quick, low current. His mouth made a stubborn line, then a worried one, then a pale one. At last he nodded 3 times, each nod a surrender, and reached for his apron with the air of a man who had just agreed to be struck repeatedly by fortune and would like it over with. Nicholas folded his arms against the cold and told himself not to ask. Questions are a virtue until they are a vice. He could see Bink's reflection in the glass beside his own, small and bright-eyed, already sketching in the air with a fingertip as if the window pane were paper. Type hierarchy. Bink murmured, big letters to catch, even the milk blink. Then the dare. Always the dare. He smiled up at Nicholas. You'll like it. It will look official. I don't need it to look official. Nicholas said. I need it to look safe. Jericho emerged 20 minutes later with the feral satisfaction of a locksmith who has met a lock worth her time, 200 posters by midday. She said, rush fee, waived. Nicholas squinted at her. I don't want to know? Then don't ask, she said. Cheerful as a bell, she tapped his breastplate with 2 fingers. And before you grow a sermon paid properly, I use leverage to negotiate speed, not theft to erase price. Inside, Aldous tied his apron, rolled his sleeves, and set to with the fussiness of a priest preparing the altar. His shop smelled like linseed and ash black, a perfume of ink that spoke of patience and the stained cuffs. Wooden cases lined the wall, little drawers full of letters sorted left and right into lower and upper, a geography that made apprentices into poets by accident. He picked through the little forest of sorts with a compositor's touch, long as a round O, emphatic capitals, loading them into a composing stick, while Bink hovered 3 respectful paces away and tried not to interfere, and failed. Perhaps a heavier face for the title Bink suggested. Unable to keep the scholar out of his voice. A boulder cut. It wants to bark across a street. Aldis gave him a look that printers reserve for amateurs who are nonetheless correct, and swapped the line of type with only the smallest side. He locked the letters into a chase, set the frame on the bed of his press, inked the form with a pair of padded balls, and laid the first dampened sheet on the tympan under the frisket. Then the long, familiar rhythm swing. Lay close, pull the bar so the platen bit the paper with a sweet pressure, release, lift, peel back the sheet with the care of a midwife. The first proof came up black and a little wet, a square of night with words bitten into it. Aldis held it at arm's length, Bink, all but vibrating. Read aloud, "The Haunted Walk of Arakai," he intoned, as if summoning it. Subtitle, "A Night of Scares and Adventure If You Dare." Below, particulars, All Hallows Eve, dusk till midnight, 2 gold coins per person. His finger traced the lower lines. Into the woods of Arakai, follow the torches, not recommended for the faint of heart. Oh, that sings? Jericho cocked her head. What's that at the bottom? A little eye, Bink said, slightly sheepish, stylized, just there to whisper. People will notice it and not know they have. Nicholas studied the page. The letters looked like a town crier in ink clear, loud, unembarrassed. He liked the orderliness of information, the promise of entrance and exit, of hour and place, even the warning, which he had objected to in theory, sat there like a dare someone tells themselves they can ignore. We keep the price where people can see it, he said. No haggling at the door, if we adjust for children or those who can't pay. That's grace, not a trick. Of course, Bink said, delighted that they were now arguing as producers, and a box at the exit for those who wish to thank us twice. Aldis checked the proof, made a few small adjustments that looked like alchemy and were really percentages of space, the breadth between letters. The little aisles our eyes like to walk, and then the press began to speak in earnest. He and his apprentice fell into a cadence that made time behave ink, sheet, pull, peel, hang. The damp paper swayed on cords stretched like laundry across the shop. Each poster a small proclamation of an evening not yet real. By noon, the ink-damp forest of their ambition could be harvested. Jericho handled the payment. The total came to a sum that made even Nicholas's frugal heart thud. But the rush fee was indeed absent, and all this added a handful of extra sheets in case walls eat them. As he put it, Jericho signed the ledger with a flourish that did not match her name and gathered the stack with a thief's care that had decided to be honest today. Bink, meanwhile, begged and was granted one small indulgence a second. Smaller handbill for shop windows, repeating the title and the hour with only the I at the bottom. For layering, he explained. You see it twice. You believe in it? They divided the posters and the town as if planning a military campaign. Nicholas took the village notice board by the well. the smithy's door, and the temple, where his name and sigil still opened quiet frowns into reluctant permission. He hammered the first bill to the board with 4 neat tacks and a brief, silent oath we will do no harm, space filled around his with market prices and lost chicken please. The haunted walk's black letters shouldered in among cabbages. At the smithy, Tormund grunted at the title and told him gruffly to put it where it would hide the draft. At the apothecary, Eliza Thornberry all but danced behind the counter. "It's beautiful," she said, tracing the etched eye near the bottom with one careful fingertip. And Nicholas remembered her delighted gasp in the dungeon when the torch turned green. Jericho went hunting for the noisier places, guild boards, the farmers' collective, the cartwrights' lean-to, the scruffy alley where the boys practiced knife games they shouldn't. She wove through rooms with that lawless elegance of hers, posted 2 bills side by side where she wanted to double the effect, and made it her business to murmur the story into the right ears old men who trade skepticism for a laugh, teenage girls daring each other with their eyebrows, wives who would decide whether husband's pride or children's curiosity ruled the night. At the temple, she deferred to Nicholas and waited outside, twirling a sprig of something she'd pilfered from the apothecary's doorstep while he asked permission of a priest who took a long time to say yes and then said, "On the gate, not the door." Bink took the friendlier circuit apothecary, general store, schoolhouse, and the flagon itself because he could sell a smile as a thesis for bravery practice. He told a ring of children chalking a hop game in the square, and they squealed in outrage at the thought they might be excluded. "Oh, you may come," he said solemnly, "if your grown-up sign with a thumbprint to Goethe." He delivered the first poster as if it were a gift of state. She hung it behind the bar where even men allied to their stools would have to read it between sips, then clapped Bink on the shoulder so hard he stumbled. "You 3," she said, with the kind of pride innkeepers save for those they've decided to adopt, "are either brilliant or bonkers either way. It'll fill my rooms next week." A traveling merchant rolled his cart through at mid-afternoon, canvas flapping like a sailorman's grin. Jericho intercepted him the way a falcon intercepts a hare, swiftly, politely, inescapably. She pressed a neat handful of posters into his keeping with a small purse to sweeten the way. "South in the morning," she asked, and he nodded. "Hang them where people are bored enough to read. Inns, wayposts. I'll know if you don't," she added, smiling in a way that carried both threat and gratitude. And he, who had met many towns and many teeth, promised faithfully, by late light. It seemed that anything in Milhaven that would hold paste and paper had been given a message. The great board in the square was a patchwork of their black scream, and everything else, the smithy's door bristled with the iron and invitation. The flagon's hearth wall had become a shrine to the possibility of fun. Even the temple gate wore a copy like a cautious corsage, and people who can never leave a new thing alone clustered around the bills as around a well. They read in 2s and 3s. They made low comments. They laughed in the key of nerves. A boy tried to reach the bottom to pry off the eye. His friend hauled him down with a yank, and the shared insult of 8-year-olds who will be cousins until they're 80. Nicholas watched the change take the town. It is a rare pleasure to witness a rumor become a fact in an afternoon, the phrase haunted walk began to migrate from poster ink to mouth, and from mouth to plan. He heard it at the baker's. We'll go after I pull the lost loaves at the pump. You're going, aren't you? At the schoolhouse, we can hold hands all the way. That makes us brave twice. He watched the price work its surprisingly gentle arithmetic as some flinched. Some nodded. A few already counted out coins in their heads and calculated which cousin would be the bravest to put in front. At the temple gate, the priest to whom he'd appealed earlier came out and read the poster a second time, lips moving. He looked at Nicholas in a way that contained both worry and a suspicion that perhaps the world would not go to its ruin if people allowed themselves to play at fear when the corn was in and the nights grew long. You'll run it clean, the priest said. Not quite a question. We will, Nicholas said. Rules, ropes, and exits. We're building something that mines the bones and the souls. The priest said, and the souls. Nicholas agreed as the sky bruised toward purple. The three of them reconvened at the square's wall, smudged with paste, giddy as apprentices. Bink had ink on his nose. Jericho had a paper cut on her thumb, sucked it, and pronounced that it tasted of victory. Nicholas let himself look around and see their work a village grafted to a new idea like an apple bough to a sturdy trunk, the graft taped with poster glue and held in place by curiosity. This, Bink said softly, unable to keep his voice from widening with hope, is how a night begins before its twilight. This, Jericho echoed, more practical and no less pleased, is how a coin chest starts filling before you put it on a stool. Nicholas allowed himself the smallest of smiles. Above the square, the bell tower breathed a single note. It sounded less like warning than blessing. They went back to the cave with sleeves rolled and a mood that meant business. Posters were one kind of promise. This was the other. The woods of Arakai received them in late afternoon hush. The path they'd worn yesterday already remembering their feet. At the mouth, fog pooled in the way light pools in a window seat at dusk, and the ivy that curtained a stone parted under Jericho's gloved hand like hair. Gentlemen, she said, with a flourish that belonged on a stage. To the unglamorous part of glamour, they started with the unholy housekeeping. The village guard had done the rough work hauling the bodies out the previous morning with respectful efficiency and a shovel-sour look. They'll have a pyre down by the creek, Nicholas said quietly, recalling how the bailiff preferred to keep griefs useful. Fire bless them, even goblins. Bink bowed his head for 3 beats, one for the dead, one for the living, one for the uncounted in between, and then clapped his hands once, a signal to the air itself. His small cantrip swept outward like a polite wind, prestidigitation coaxing away the worst of the smell. It didn't lie. It tidied. There is a difference. They cleared detritus as if unbuilding a story cracked pots. A goat skull grim with candle wax. A spell book that was only 3 stained pages from a mill ledger. Twine caught like spider silk across a low arch. Jericho used a hooked rod to haul down the goblin totems one by one. The farm tools wired together into shapes that hinted at faces. She set the pieces aside with a gentleness that surprised even her. Artifacts, she said, as if to herself, of bad days. They don't get to decide the mood anymore. Nicholas found a broom, somewhere really a stick with ambition, and set about sweeping grit toward the walls. He worked a steady, a penitent liturgy he remembered from temple floors. Push. Draw back. Push. The cave kept answering with its own small music drip and the distant fox-like laughter of water as it ran away in seams unseen. He paused every few minutes to listen for the low song that means bad air. Test, he said. And Binka lit the stub of a taper. They cupped the flame and stepped 3 paces deeper. It burned clean and high. Good, Nicholas murmured. We keep venting in mind, no bottlenecks. They built their route with rope and modest cunning. Jericho measured by a stride, dropping chalk marks a white line where groups should pause, an X where a spotter would stand. Arrows you wouldn't see if you didn't know to look. A carnival path in a cave dress, she said. Pleased, she drove small stakes where the floor rolled down, ran a dark cord from shoulder height to shoulder height along tight curves, and added invisible slip knots she could free with one tug if something snagged that shouldn't under her breath. She hummed not a song so much as the metronome of craft. If we're asking them to place their trust in our feet, we place our trust in the stone, Nicholas said. He wedged shims under a lip where the rock had spalled away, padded a frost-cracked rim with felt and waxed thread, and sanded a slick patch with a handful of coarse grit and a brick he'd brought from the flagon's back step. I don't want one grandmother going down because my pride liked the look of a shine. Bink performed little acts of domestic sorcery that made the space hospitable without letting it forget itself. He dried a wet corner with a wave and whisper, warmed a bench-shaped boulder so a waiting group could sit and tell each other, quite bravely, that they weren't nervous at all. He coaxed a line of faint glow from moss with a phrase that tasted like mint in the mouth, then grimaced when it offered more light than he'd intended. Too cheerful. We'll save that for the exit, he said, stuffed the glow back into its spores with a murmured apology, and moved on. They insisted, again and again, on the difference between fear and harm. Jericho articulated her creed while crouched over a corridor mouth, hands busy tying a thread to an iron ring. There's gallows scary, she said, which I will not peddle to the children of people who smiled at me on the street today. And there's good scary, where your body thinks it's about to tumble, and you laugh when it doesn't. That's the line. If it bruises, if it burns, if someone's ankle or dignity is truly endangered, there's lazy work, and lazy is not our language. Lazy, Bink agreed, with a professor's disdain and crude. There's finer embroidery at hand. He conjured a handful of chaff from nowhere, let it drift, and watch the air eddies in a tight bend. See here the breeze curls. Sound will behave strangely. A soft groan from the stones. He made a note. There's your first whisper. Nicholas had saved his portion for last, not because he feared it, but because he meant to approach it as a craftsman approaches a sacred commission, with clean tools and a steady heart. He unrolled a length of linen from his pack. On it lay small jars of mineral pigment he'd ground in the flagon's scullery, last night ironed red, bone white, soot black, bound with egg and patience. He mixed with a wooden stick and a prayer that was mostly a promise to himself. I won't write names, he said to the stone. No true seals, no real words, only the echoes. Fear does not get to borrow the holy voice. Jericho watched from a respectful distance. Tail looped around her ankle the way it did when she chose to be still. My grandmother used to put a triangle of chalk over the door, she said softly, said it made mischief, think twice. Not a spell, a sign that somebody loved the people who slept behind that wood. Nicholas smiled inside his mouth. Then this is just a reminder that someone is paying attention. With a brush, he trimmed down to a dozen hairs. He painted the first sigil. It was an off-kilter cousin of a true ward. Lines bent a degree or two away from comfort. Curves that hesitated where true ones flowed. It glowed when the damp stone drank it not bright, but enough to make anyone's inner ear tilt. In a cluster of 3, a pattern whispered to instinct wrong. Wrong, almost right. The eye understands such things even when the mind says. It's only paint. Uncanny in the best way, Bink said. Hovering with the hush he reserved for good experiments and newborns. People won't read it. They'll feel the draft it leaves in their ribs. Nicholas worked down the wall, spacing the pseudoglyphs with a mason's care. The ethics of it stayed unknotted. He was imitating rather than counterfeiting, crafting mood without theft. He had seen real desecration shrines cracked for sport, blessing bowls upended into filth. This wasn't that. This was a stagecraft in a vocabulary the town already spoke, translated back into play. They scrubbed until the high torch brackets held only the memory of soot. They unfurled a runner of coarse canvas down the first 30 feet, a kind of cave carpet to steady feet still learning the dark. They hammered a peg by the entrance where Bink would fix a lantern that did not burn, though it bravely pretended to, a continuous light bound inside gloss. All show, no risk. Your goddess has opinions about fire codes, he told Nicholas out of the corner of his mouth. And Nicholas, who had been an altar boy for a decade of winter feasts, allowed that she certainly did. In the second chamber, the size of a small chapel, with a ceiling that gathered echoes the way a pew gathers splinters, Jericho found a trap she had not set. It was goblin work, crude but effective, a loop across the floor that would have yanked a leg out from under someone who didn't deserve to learn about gravity that way. She traced it to its pin with a contemptuous curl of her lip and cut it free. No, she said, to the memory of the hands that made it, not today. She reset the loop as a song instead, tied the thread to a row of thin bells that would hiss when brushed and leave a soft chime in the wake. Startle, she said, pleased, not a strike. They staged their offstage, an art in itself. The chicken exit, Bink said, with a grin that admitted he might be first through it if one of his illusions misbehaved. He marked it with 3 red chalk lines and hung a cloth that would fall aside under a knuckles push. Left-hand wall. Always? We tell them twice. And once more. He practiced the patter under his breath. Welcome. Welcome. Stay with your group. If you wish to leave early, step left and follow the red marks. Nothing will follow you. In a narrow throat of corridor, Nicholas wedged a length of smooth driftwood into a seam at shoulder height, an easy handhold painted to match a stone for anyone whose courage came with clammy palms. In the broad room that had served as the goblin throne, he dragged the crate into a corner and declared it a marshal's perch. If I say, hold, you hold, he told the cave, and it seemed to listen. They ate their noon bread sitting on a ledge that looked out over the first bend, legs swinging. The bread was yesterday's, the cheese a little proud, the apples perfect October bottled in a skin. Bink produced a paper twist of salt from a pocket that had earlier held a small hammer and dusted it over the apple slices with ceremony. Fuel, he said, for the choreography of fear. Jericho chewed, then pointed with her apple at the first torch bracket. That's where you start the color. She said, base gold outside. Then inside, she waggled her fingers in an imitation so gleeful, Bink's eyes went bright. Make it green that remembers being blue. Stain the stone. People step from one world to the next, with their pupils already wider. Green that remembers being blue. Bink repeated reverently, I can do that. By late afternoon, the place had begun to change under their hands, from goblin hole to venue. The floor told Boots where to go. The walls murmured rather than menaced. Jericho's chalk marks multiplied into a language only she spoke. The air felt fresher simply because someone had paid attention to it. Even the shadows seemed to stand straighter, as if they'd been told they were now part of a company and had better hit their cues. Nicholas wiped sweat with the heel of his hand and took a moment at the mouth of the corridor that would end in the shrine room. The light slanted into dust. A fly traced a lazy figure 8. Somewhere far off, water set its metronome under the stone. He felt that click in the heart that comes when a thing passes from plan to place. The bones are sound, he said. Now we dress them and rehearse them, Jericho added, scooping up her coil of rope. Tomorrow, traps, and tune them, Bink said, rolling his shoulders like a musician testing a bow. Tomorrow, light and movement and voices in the wall. They stood together a moment in the doorway, 3 figures outlined against a cave that had consented to become a theater. Outside, the day had taken the color of pewter again. In a side, it was preparing to be many things at once, corridor and a story. Rumor and corridor, fear and laughter yoked like a good team under harness. Nicholas breathed in a stone and dust and the faint whiff of egg in the paint. He thought of the villagers reading their posters, warming themselves by a hearth and deciding whether they were brave. He hoped they would discover they were. Back at first light, he said, "Bring your ceremonial armor," Jericho replied, flashing him a grin that promised wicked choreography. "An extra chalk," Bink said, eyes already seeing green that remembers blue. They stepped out into the trees, and the cave kept their footprints like a memory it meant to rehearse. They returned at first light with a satchel of chalks, 3 packets of patience, and the kind of happiness that looks suspiciously like industry. The cave received them cool as a cellar. The rope guides waited like quiet ushers. The canvas runner drank the dew from their boots. "Today," Bink said, setting his staff against the wall, "we teach the dark to sing in color." The torches were old iron brackets cunningly hammered to hold faggots of pitchy pine. Bink touched each with 2 fingers and a syllable that tasted like pennyroyal, then blew, as if snuffing and kindling at once. The first flame rose ordinary gold home fire honest while he listened, the way bakers listen for the moment dough decides to become bread. Then he hummed a tone hardly louder than a bee's opinion and slid his thumb across the tongue of the flame. Green crept in, not the sour green of rot, but a mineral shade you sometimes see in copper roofs after long rain, a color that remembered once being blue. Stone took it on like a bruise. "There," he said softly, a throat note. "Shift again on my count." By the second torch, he had refined the recipe 2 breaths of gold to warm the eye and soothe the heart. Then, while the body relaxed, the slow bloom of color that made edges look less certain and shadows more likely. People don't fear the dark, he said, coaxing the hue along. Speaking as much to himself as to them, they fear the idea that their eyes have failed them. If we make the stone seem to move while it stands still, they will lend us the rest. Nicholas set his palm to the wall and watched the color mutated across his gauntlet. The light bruised the hard planes of the metal into something almost organic. He tested the bracket's bolts without being asked, tugging until iron answered with a clean complaint. High, he advised, out of reach for the eager, I'll lay sweat felt around the sockets so if a coal drops, it drops tame. Jericho watched, still as a poised cat, and tracked how shadows lengthened and shortened as Bink changed the fuel and the spell. There, she said, when a corner deepened into something vaguely human-shaped. That alcove will hold you like a rumor. Nicholas, stand there and even your statue breath will look like wind. They moved from bracket to bracket, Bink threading color into fire, Nicholas checking hazard and hammering in wedges where old stone had tricked itself into thinking it was flint again, Jericho marking where shadow fell most treacherously. The torches learned a rhythm and opening warm as bread, a middle that faltered the eye, a last lingering pulse of something witchy that made every ordinary object think it might be more. When they reached the first bend, Bink patted his pockets, produced a twist of dried herbs, considered, and then flared the flame through a pinch that it smelled faintly of crushed fur. The light wavered as if a draft had spoken to it. Do you feel it? He asked. Delighted? Not wind? Suggestion? An illusion should never shout when a murmur works. Spoken like a thief, Jericho said, approving. The armors waited in a cold herd where Nicholas had staged them the day before, breastplates that had met better days and worse blows, gorgets with dents that told unkind stories, gauntlets more a scar than glove. He'd propped them with poles that disappeared into shadow and anchored their feet with stones so they'd not topple when a boy with more daring than sense brushed past. They need breath, Bink observed, hands already sketching in the air. He began with a helm set on a pole at head height, touching the brow with his first two fingers and murmuring a charm that sounded like a lullaby for iron. Nothing took. Then everything did. The helmet tilted a hair's breadth, as if a neck had shifted. In green light, the movement seemed larger than it was, like the way a small fish looks enormous in a deep bucket. Nicholas stepped close, trained to distrust anything that pretended life without earning it. The helmet turned the barest degree toward his warmth. He said, which in Nicholas was the equivalent of applause. It's not alive, Bink said quickly, hearing the paladin's ethics begin to count. It listens for heat and shadow. Proximity only. It will not pursue. It will attend. Attend, Jericho echoed, tasting the word. Make it breathe slow. Faster and they'll think it wants something. Bink laid an open palm on a breastplate and fed the charm down through metal like dye through cotton. A hand flexed, a gauntlet cupped. A half-severed pauldron shifted its weight on a non-existent shoulder. He tuned each to a slightly different pulse so that no two armors moved in unison. In concert, they did not look enchanted. They looked haunted by memory. Nicholas hung back a few paces and watched the effect, as a patron would from the corner of an eye, With a friend's elbow at his side, a helm turned toward the imagined presence of a passerby, then stilled, as if satisfied. Breath he'd been holding went out in a measured stream. "There's your choir," he said to Bink, who beamed and rubbed soot off his nose with a blacker finger. They hauled the goblin-forged weapons up from the heap where Nicholas had gathered them notch-toothed swords, axes too heavy for sense, spears with poor balance and good intentions. Bink chose a smaller assortment than he'd first planned. "Too many will read as show," he said, "and we're building a world, not a fairground," and suspended them on hair-thin threads charmed to vanish in the new light. A blade turned idly as if remembering a last arc. A staff rotated and bumped its neighbor with a sleepy clink. The sound did a small, precise thing inside the ear. It whispered metal where no hands should be. Jericho passed beneath them, her horn tips almost brushing an axe head, and squinted up. 2 inches higher on that cleaver, she said, "A tall farmer with a tall hat will thank us." Nicholas planted himself at a junction and tried to imagine the flow, a group of 5 entering cautious as cats. The torch shifting color, a net whispering down 20 paces ahead. The first nervous giggle, a turn, an armor that breathed. He checked the threads on the floating weapons, ran a thumb along their attachment. Imagined a boy jumping because boys are springs in boots. "Secure," he said, "but I'll stand near this corner for the first hour and learn the crowd." Bink allowed himself one indulgence that was more scholar than showman. In the long corridor that would carry people toward Nicholas's alcove, he chalked a few circles on a square of flat stone and rolled a bead of quicksilver through them with the tip of a brush while murmuring an old mnemonic. Then he blew very gently. Dust lifted, drifted, settled, lifted again, barely there, but enough to thicken the air in a vertical seam so that you felt it colder on the cheek you didn't expect. He looked absurdly pleased. "Edge of eye," he said. "People believe their eyes, they're wrong. They believe the edges of their eyes, they're doomed." "Poetry," Jericho said, "disturbing poetry." They resisted the urge to overfill. Stage people have a vice called more. They chose restraint instead. 1 illusory draft, not 3. 1 set of floating blades, not a forest. Movements so small they required nerve to admit you'd seen them. A man will swear the armor turned its head. Bink wiggled a gauntlet a finger's width, and his wife will laugh because she didn't. Both will be right. Nicholas's sigils, painted the day before, took on a stranger life in the new light. The iron red went to claret. The bone white went to something like old milk. In clusters, the not quite holy signs suggested meaning without delivering it. Jericho stood before a triplet and frowned pleasantly. "You made the wall look as if it forgot a prayer halfway through," she said. And Nicholas felt his shoulders ease at the compliment. He had promised himself he wouldn't lie with sanctity. He hadn't. He had told the truth about forgetting. In the shrine chamber, they decided how much majesty the finale needed. The makeshift altar of crates remained. They draped it in a torn bit of sailcloth that had drifted into Jericho's pack months ago for reasons no one questioned. Bink chalked a circle overhead on the ceiling rock, eyes half closed in the way that means a wizard is measuring distances you can't see. "I won't show the eye yet," he said. "Only the glow of its lid. The opening itself belongs to rehearsal day. He licked his thumb and smudged a line. The ceiling seemed to deepen. People will think the room is taller. Most will not look up. That is their mistake, which we will reward. By noon, the cave had become a study in almosts, almost movement, almost voices, almost meaning. Jericho wriggled into a crevice that had become her favorite and whispered just to try the echo. It slid along the wall like silk and came back touching their necks. "Hello, dear hearts," she breathed, half to herself, and even Nicholas's well-disciplined spine took that one extra degree of a straightness that says a body would prefer to be elsewhere. They ate again like laborers, sitting on the same ledge with better cheese. Bink sketched their progress on another napkin, mapping each beat of light and motion the way an old dance master maps steps. Warm, shift, first breath of the wall, whisper net, idle blade, attend, attend. He flicked his fingers toward the armors and then your reveal. He glanced up at Nicholas. "You still certain?" Nicholas looked at the alcove chosen for him. A mouth within a mouth. He could already feel the weight of the ceremonial plate on his shoulders, the helm enclosing sound to a private chapel where his breathing would be the only hymn. He imagined 5 neighbors clustering close, arguing whether he was metal or man. He imagined striking the hammer to the shield and watching fear turn to laughter as they ran. Certain, he said, if we do it right, they will not feel mocked. They will feel tested and then proud. Jericho licked a thumb and rubbed a smudge from the cleft of a stone as if she could polish the cave into a mirror. "Humiliation is easy," she said. "We'll give them something better. The joy that comes right after I can't becomes I did." By late afternoon, they walked the route in silence, each placing themselves in the skin of a visitor. The torches deepened to that mineral green as they moved. The blades turned as if they had always done so. A helm pivoted its regard in the precise measure between greeting and warning. It was too much and not enough at once, which is exactly where good spectacle lives. At the mouth, with trees making their evening knit above the cave, they stopped. Bink adjusted the first torch with a fussy tenderness and then stepped back, hands on hips, head tilted. "We have restraint," he said, almost in disbelief. "Who would have guessed? Don't get cocky," Jericho said, bumping his shoulder with her own. "Tomorrow you'll want to add a banshee and I'll have to sit on you." Nicholas took one last, slow drink of the scene, a tunnel of not quite ordinary light. Quiet machines disguised as relics, the promise of a night that would teach a village to be brave together. "Light and breath," he said. "Tomorrow voices." Bink nodded, satisfied in the way only a maker is when the thing in his head has condescended to live in the world. He pinched out the first torch. The cave swallowed the last color like a secret. They brought the sounds in last. The way you bring in a choir after you've tuned the room. Morning sat cool in the trees. The rope guides wore dew. A jay heckled them from the beach as if auditioning. Bink came with a pouch of pebbles no bigger than thumbnails and a martyr whose rim remembered many experiments. "Ears lie," he said cheerfully. "Let's teach them how." He knelt beside the first bottleneck and rubbed a stone until his fingers gleamed with mica, then whispered into it in the language that makes air take notes. When he pressed the pebble into a crack, the wall took a breath, a low groan, no louder than a careful hinge. unrolled at knee height and walked ahead of them like rumor. The sound did not say pain. It said weight moving somewhere you couldn't see. Jericho tilted her head, listening the way a locksmith listens for pins to fall. Good, but slower by half. We want the suggestion that something answers, not the thing itself. Bink tuned 2 fingers, a phrase, a precise insult to the stone that made it sulk more softly. He staggered the rest 1 pebble that is scratched at the edge of hearing, like a mouse behind a wainscot, one that dropped a single chain clink into the corridor when a warm body passed, one that sounded like a sigh from a grate that no one could find. No more than 1 per chamber, Nicholas said, counting like a quartermaster. Laughter needs a space if we crowd the senses. Fear turns into noise. Jericho was chalking perches, her marks small and private. She found a fissure shoulder high that let her lower her voice right to ear level. You shouldn't have come, she tested, in a tone so gentle it sounded like advice from a grandmother who had seen the river flood. It came back changed by the stone thinner, colder, as if the cave added its own measure of old water. She shivered, pleased at the neatness of the effect, and marked the surrounding floor with the faintest scrape, her range line, which no one but Jericho would ever see. At the mouth, they built weather. Bink set a black iron pot just inside the arch-wide belly. Good lip, the sort that had boiled a ham in a farmhouse 2 owners ago. Under it, he bound a heat the way you bind a promise steady, strong, not showy. Water bloomed into vapor that is spilled across the threshold and pooled ankle deep. He fed it a shaving of rosemary for a forest note and a pinch of peat dust so it would smell like rain remembered. Fog curled into the runner and then sorted itself around their ankles as if taking measure. This, Bink said, straightening, is where the first brave laugh will happen. Someone will call it silly. That's good. You want to boast before a scare, it's an old dance. Nicholas studied where condensation gathered. He rubbed a thumb along the canvas to feel for the slickness, shook a little grit where the pot's breath made a glaze, and slid a shallow oak tray beneath the rim to catch drips before they made mischief. We'll keep a bucket and rag here, he said, and a mat for boots when the rain comes. The first hazard in any procession is not the spectacle, it's the puddle. They treated the approach like a festival lane. Outside, under the trees, they planted 2 poles topped with lanterns that did not burn but had the decency to look as if they did. A rope between them made a gate. A second rope snaked a patient line for those waiting. Jericho tied a series of soft knots in red twine and slipped them over the railing. Markers, she said. When we set a group loose, we slide one down. When it hits the last knot, we send the next. No crowding the throat. Milhaven already knew how to move together. Harvest processions had beadles who walked with poles to clear the way. Funerals stepped to a bell's pace so grief could keep up. They borrowed those habits of care, and will have someone walk the line. Nicholas added, an old village trick. A man with a lantern talking to each cluster quiets trouble before it starts. He said it because of the stories every town keeps about the festivals that went wrong. The solstice bonfire 3 parishes west that leaned at the last and taught a field to burn. The summer fair on a riverbank where someone miscounted, and the bridge crowded until timbers sighed. The harvest dance 2 decades back when a rogue spark found a hem. None had happened here, but enough had happened somewhere that people's bodies carried the lesson in their shoulders. Processions weren't magic, they were decisions made in advance inside. Jericho rigged her first net. She chose a panel of shadow and lifted a belly of twine until it kissed the ceiling, then loaded it with weight that looked threatening and wasn't rope knots wrapped in sacking. Padded pulls dressed up to resemble iron. A tap on a tripwire set it breathing, then whispering downward as if exhausted by its own menace, she lay beneath it, pressed both hands flat to the floor, and let it fall across her shoulders. Kisses, she pronounced. No crush. Nicholas packed 2 cushions into the corners where a child might drop to dodge. People will try to be clever, he said. We build for them too. Bink walked the route with his hands out like a dowser, feeling for heights, knee, hip, shoulder, crown. He tuned the sound pebbles to trigger on the warm weight of a group, rather than a single child who has skipped faster than the rest. He charmed the floating instruments to ignore the reach of small hands. It pays to assume the bold will be short, he said, half smiling. If anyone deserves to touch a miracle, it's the child who dared to lead. He set the first blade's rotation to slow and inexorable, like a clock that had forgotten how to count. The second he left almost still, so that the shift in torch color would do the work of suggesting motion. 2 illusions can quarrel. Better one speaks at a time. The finale needed a heart that wasn't just volume in the shrine room. The makeshift altar stood under Bink's chalked circle. He tested the eye at last with only them to witness. He breathed once, nodded to Nicholas and Jericho ready, and opened the lid of nothing. It was only a light at first, a low, redder glow that widened gradually into an oculus the color of banked coals. A rim of the stone around it seemed to deepen with each heartbeat, as if the room had acquired an upstairs. The eye itself did not appear all at once. It accreted iris darkening from smoke to slate, pupil settling to a black that felt like felt when it looked down upon them. The sound arrived late, a dry grind, subtle as a mill beginning to turn. Dust lifted from the altar cloth and hung in a sunless beam. Jericho laughed once, involuntarily. Nicholas's neck remembered the service where the carved saints over the nave had seemed to listen. Only when every back is in the room, Bink said, breathless. He brushed the air, and the lid drooped, lashes of shadow crossing a light that was both not and was no sooner. The cue is the heat of a full group, not the footfall of one jackrabbit. We don't want a boy running in to take the courage out of the others. Nicholas put on the ceremonial plate to practice his own miracle. He had polished it last night, then scuffed it with a handful of dirt. He looped a few roots through joints, as if the dungeon had been slowly reclaiming the metal. He donned the great helm last of all. The world narrowed to his own breath and a slot of greenish light that gave back his reflection in fragments on the inside of the visor. He took his place in the alcove Jericho had marked for him, lifted the hammer, and settled into the statue's ask, be a thing. He counted down a group that wasn't there yet, 5 heartbeats, for 5 villagers felt them cluster, felt the pause that establishes what something is. On the 6th beat, he stepped forward, inches only, and brought the hammer down on the shield. The cave made the sound larger. Nicholas winced too much for older ears this close and wrapped the rim of the shield with a loop of woolen cloth. dulling the next strike to thunder heard from a hill away. Jericho watched with her arms folded, tail curled round her boot. Once, she said, and then still. Hit again only if a fool lingers to poke. The second strike is for the second group. Nicholas agreed. Voice a hollowed thing in the helm. Dignity is in the first. They rehearsed flow like a ritual. Bink stood at the mouth and spoke the welcome as if they were the strangers. Thank you for coming to the haunted walk of Arakai. Stay with your group. Follow the lit path. If you wish to leave early, step left and follow the red marks out. Some things may seem to touch you. Nothing will keep you. He bowed and sent them in no more than 6 a line of imaginary courage. Jericho made the net sigh. The wall found its groan. A single blade juddered and blinked. Nicholas became metal and then not. In the shrine, the eye opened exactly as their shoulders cleared the threshold. When they turned to leave, Bink drew a little hush from the air so that footsteps sounded louder. People like to hear themselves getting away. Outside, they rehearse the part that never makes it into legend but keeps legends from ending badly. The line, Jericho paced out the stanchions under the beeches, set a little stool where Bink would sit with the chest, and a second for a lad from the flagon who would swap silver and copper for clumsy hands full of gold. Nicholas drove posts so a rope would keep the wading from bulging into the trail. We limit, he said. We never let excitement argue us out of the count. He thought of last year's lantern walk, when someone had brought too many candles and a gust had gone through the churchyard like a sigh. Not everything the crowd wants, they get. That's how you keep next year. By late afternoon, the cave felt finished enough to consent to practice on real feet. They ran the route twice more, once at a walk, once at an eager post-sundown hurry. The sounds lifted, settled. The fog breathed without soaking the runner. The eye opened and shut as if it had always been there, a patient sentinel. Jericho's whispers set the skin between shoulder blades to alert. Nicholas's single thunder made even Jericho jolt and then grin in acknowledgement. When they stepped back out among the trees, the light had gone to copper and the first thin cold was threading from the creek. Bink tied off the pot and said a word that would keep dew from undoing their work. Tomorrow, costumes and timing, he said, already counting beats in the air with 2 fingers, and the rules one more time until even Tormund could recite them in his sleep. Jericho brushed chalk from her palms and left a ghost of white on the leg of Nicholas's greave. And I'll mark 2 more hides, she said, because restraint is admirable, but surprise is the salt. Nicholas looked back into the mouth where the fog pooled like thought, and the green light made the first bend look like a threshold to a world that asked something and then gave it back. We have the root, he said. We have the breath. He shouldered the hammer and felt its weight settle into a familiar kindness. Now we teach it to keep time with the village. They devoted a morning to the ancient art of becoming someone else. It began with a table laid like a surgeon's tray paints, wax, grease, thread, bits of leather, a spool of silver leaf that Jericho swore she had acquired honestly this time. The cave was cooler than a square. Breath came visible at first and then was tamed by the work. Costumes, Bink announced, with that sermonizing cheer of his, are not lies, they're permissions. Jericho started with leather the color of midnight, and a handful of tattered strips she braided through the seams, so they would flutter when she moved. The base was practical hard plates where a stumble might kiss stone, soft where she needed to fold. Then she began the theater. She tied a cord low around her ribs so that each breath lifted the ragged hem of a drape like a whisper. She left her horns full length, unfiled this week, and gilded them with a fingertip of silver so that even a breath of torchlight would make them glint, as if something were waking inside. Face paint followed charcoal, and bone white laid in planes that sharpened what was already striking. She ran a blade's width of white up the ridge of each horn, as if moonlight had settled there and refused to leave. When she raised her eyes at last, the cave answered with a hush. She looked like a rumor that had learned to walk. Terrifying, Binks said, meaning it as high praise. Jericho bared her teeth and then, unexpectedly, softened the grin into something almost playful. I will not be cruel, she said, more to herself than to them. Quick startle, quick release. She painted the last line across her cheekbone, a slash of pale that read as a scar from a distance and as a paint a stroke up close. Children think in symbols? I'll give them symbols that look sharp and feel like theater. Binks' own transformation was craft rather than cosmetics. He had threaded enchantments into the hem of his robes last night, tiny weather stutters of air that made the cloth breathe when he stood still. Now he stitched in the last seam with hands that smelled faintly of tallow and ink. He charmed his staff so that small, polite sparks would pop at the top if he rapped it once against stone, and bound a mild crackle into the wood so it murmured like a hearth when he leaned on it. Eyes, he said, almost shy. He touched 2 fingers to his lids, whispered, blinked. When he opened them, the pupils glowed milk white, not all the time, only when he wanted the air to take a step back. Lasts 4 heartbeats. He reported enough to make a sentence sound like a prophecy and then stop before anyone gets cross. He practiced a smile that canceled the omen after and succeeded. The effect delighted him precisely because it could be turned off. Nicholas's armor lived in a trunk the way a memory lives in the back of the mind. He hadn't worn this set in years except for ceremonies where the weight was symbolic more than defensive. The plate still took polish. He gave it one, then rubbed it with a grip of dirt and a smear of red paint at the rim of the hammer to suggest unlucky history at a glance. He wove a few dry roots through the articulation at the knee and elbow, tucked a lattice of vine across the breast with care, as if the cave had claimed him slowly and he had consented. A faded crimson cloak found in the Guildhall chest with other leftovers from other lives he draped and then weighted so it would hang heavy, not flap. When he slotted the great helm down, the world shrank to a letterbox of color and the private drum of his breath. He lifted the hammer and tried the pose, a stillness wrapped around intention. Even Jericho drew in a breath she didn't plan. You look like a saint that changed its mind, she said. Perfect. Costumes bred logistics. They set the front of house like a little border town. At the tree gate, they planted 2 high lanterns that glowed without flame and hung a placard between them in Binks' careful hand. Welcome to the haunted walk of Arakai. Beneath in smaller letters, stay with your group. Follow the lit path. Do not touch the exhibits. If you wish to leave early, step left and follow the red marks out. Nothing inside will keep you. Jericho tied the red knotted twine along the queue rope. When the first group reached the third knot down, the second group would be fed forward, and so on. It turned waiting into rhythm. They hired 2 lantern marshals from the flagon lads who knew how to walk a line without getting in the way. Goethe lent them broad-shouldered wool cloaks, a kettle, and a stack of mugs. Mulled cider out here, she decreed, as if this had always been part of the plan, a warm thing near the mouth so no one's hands shake for the wrong reasons. The estall sat under the leaning beech, smelling of spice and apples, and had the secondary virtue of keeping people from wedging too close to the door. Nicholas added a small, neat sign to the table if you need to leave at any time. Tell a marshal, we will guide you. He placed the words for the ones who would never say them aloud. Bink selected a stool and a vantage with the scientific calm of a man choosing an observation post. He set the chest beside him, its mouth ready to take coins, and counted out a float of silver and copper for change. Jericho insisted on a second ledger, a simple tally that showed each hour's take in marks so no one can accuse me of doing math with my fingers in the box. She said, with prim innocence that made Bink a snort. I know my reputation. We'll bury it under neat columns. Midday. They ran the whole thing like a performance for an audience of 3 themselves. Bink took the gate. Welcome, welcome, pitched to carry without bark. He recited the rules clean, checked the knots on the rope, counted 6 ghosts who weren't there into the tunnel, and then sat back to let the cave speak. Jericho, already in paint, moved like a shadow that had learned the map of a body. In her false floor chamber, she let her weight sit at the very edge of the tilt, so it breathed under the boot sole and then lay still. She pressed the tripwire with a gloved knuckle and listened to the net whisper down kisses, not crush, and was pleased all over again. Twice she stopped herself from adding one more bell, one more thread. Twice she stepped back and said aloud, restraint, as if reminding a pupil. Nicholas discovered that the simplest part of the stillness was the hardest to keep honest. There's a human instinct to telegraph, to twitch a fingertip, or draw breath in a way that says, get ready. He fought that, made himself a thing. Then a man in a single beat, so clean the cave seemed to startle with the group. He tried the hammer on the shield with the wool loop in place, thunder that had learned manners. He tried a second, softer strike that he would keep for the straggler who would always reach out to touch. It sounded like a warning from a distance rather than a scold nearby. Good. Jericho approved. We let pride save face. They found their backstage too. There's a place to breathe on every route, if you choose it. Bink marked a niche near the halfway point where he could sip water, wipe chalk, and make his lips warm again so the patter wouldn't stumble. Jericho flagged a notch high on the wall where she could coil and count to 20 while 2 groups traded positions. Nicholas scraped a small seat out of an unhelpful boulder with a chisel and sat there once, armor creaking. To remember that his body was not only a statue, he set the rules to himself under the helm. Stay with your group. Follow the lit path. Do not touch. Step left if you need to leave. He made them into a prayer. The opt-out door got its last touches. Bink rehung the cloth so it fell easier, then dotted the left-hand wall with small red marks no bigger than a thumbnail that would catch the eye only at close quarters. He walked the path fast, as someone frightened would, counting the marks every third pace, he said. So the frightened brain has a ladder. He posted one of Goethe's lads at the corridor that led out and borrowed a little bell from the flagon to hang on his belt so he could jingle softly as he guided people. No shame. Nicholas reminded them all, leaving is a kind of bravery too. By late afternoon, they folded costume into choreography. Jericho in full paint took 3 of her hides in a row, a drop from above punctuated by a hissed hello. Dearest? A whisper from a slitted curtain that sounded like an old story beginning. A stillness so complete that her breath didn't move for 5 counts and then close. Warm, they're still watching. It put a bead of a sweat at Nicholas's nape, even though he knew she was there. Bink, in his moving robes, walked ahead of them, counting beats on his fingers, tapping the staff once at the keen corner so that a spark spoke without fire. He tested his eye glow on Nicholas and turned it off early with an apologetic wince. Too much if they look straight at me, he judged. We save it for the moment someone insists we are tricks. Then we give them a trick. At the mouth again. They revised the welcome until the words sat in their bones. Bink tried the patter 3 ways, settled on the one with the least ornament. Some things may seem to touch you. Nothing will keep you. He pronounced with a softness that made the promise feel honest. He added 1 line only at the end, pitched low. If at any time you wish to leave, step left, we will meet you. People don't hear all the words when they're excited. They hear the ones that feel like handholds. He put those last and said them like a hand. Twilight took the edges off the trees. The Q ropes looked suddenly like a festival instead of carpentry. The fog at the mouth breathed a little harder now that the air had cooled. Goethe herself came to test the cider and pronounced it fit for saints and sinners alike, which in her taxonomy covered everyone. She left the lads with 2 extra jugs and a lecture that could have tamed a riot. She turned at the last and took in the lanterns, the signboard, the line that didn't yet exist but would. You've made work for me, she said. Fond as a sister? Good. Work is winter's blanket. Night came on by degrees. They boot-checked the corridor, tightened threads, counted pebbles, blew on a torch, and watched the color come back obediently. Nicholas lifted the helm and let his face find air for a minute. Jericho wiped a smear from her cheek and left it imperfect on purpose. Bink folded the rule placard into a second copy and tucked it in his sleeve. If one fell in the mud, they would not be without words. He sat on his stool and looked down at the chest as if it might be a small animal that needed kindness more than coin. All right, Jericho said, rolling her shoulders, checking the lay of the knives she would not draw. Let's see if we can teach fright to behave. Nicholas sealed the helm again and felt, in the small private chapel of sound inside, the moment when his breath and the cave's breath synchronized. Bink raised the first lantern, the one that was not fire and meant safety all the same. The sign swung a little in a wind that had traveled from the fields. Somewhere far down the track, the first small group was already gathering itself, because that is what evenings like this do, they gather the willing. Front of house ready, Bink murmured, and the words clicked the night into its next shape. Dusk threw a shawl over the woods, and the beech leaves answered with their papery applause. A draft came up from the creek with the taste of rain in it, not yet falling, only promised. Lanterns at the gate held their glow like faithful teeth. Along the rope, a line had formed in the way lines form when a village chooses a story to share couples and cousins, laughing mouths that were not sure they meant it. Bink sat his little stool like a magistrate of mischief, the chest at his knee, the placard to his left, his voice, aided by a kindness of magic, carried as if the trees approved. Welcome, welcome to the haunted walk of Arakai. Stay with your group, follow the lit path, do not touch the exhibits. If you wish to leave at any time, step left and follow the red marks out. Some things may seem to touch you. He softened on the promise, nothing will keep you. The first knot of 6 approached as if nominated. Nicholas, listening from the corridor bend, named them by sound before he saw them. Martyr Greenleaf, the baker's wife. Footsteps brisk and unembarrassed. Thomas, her husband. Footsteps that stuck twice, then came along as if pulled. Cobb and Finn, farmhands who had run out of summer and were searching for some other way to prove themselves. Eliza Thornberry, the apothecary's daughter, rising on her toes to see what was not yet visible. A 6th hung back a cousin or friend, then reconsidered at the smell of cider and decided to be brave tomorrow. Fog lay like breath at the mouth. Is that real? Martyr said. And the question was not contempt. It was delight confessing itself. She held out her hand to taste the chill. Not real, Thomas insisted, the defensive certainty of a man who had decided the outcome already. The fog washed his ankles anyway and made his voice small. It's only, well, look at that. The first torch welcomed them with its honest hearth gold. They stepped into the cave, and Bink's fog pooled around their boots as if conspired. He said, "Stay together." Martyr reminded no one in particular. "So you two, to the boys. You stay where I can clouch you if you bolt." The color shift arrived like a rumor you wanted to believe the gold went mineral. The stone took on a green that remembered blue, and shadows gained opinions. Eliza laughed once, a sound like glass tapping glass. "Oh, that's cunning," she said. "Look at the edges of things." The wall sighed very softly where the first pebble lived. It did not say danger, it said wait, a movement too far to see. Thomas pulled up like a horse on new ice. Hear that he whispered. Finn clapped him on the shoulder because that is how young men treat fear when someone is watching. "Just a breeze," he said, and made his voice taller than his throat. They crossed the canvas runner that kept the wet from mischief and came to Jericho's first knot of threadbell and veil, and the net decided to be dramatic. It exhaled rather than fell. A whisper of row that breathed over shoulders and hat brims, and slid off like a cat deciding you were not worth the bother. Cobb yelped in a key that made Finn's grin wobble, then laughed too loud, which is what boys do when their bodies admit a truth faster than their mouths. "Not funny," Thomas declared. While already laughing at himself, Martyr lifted the edge of net with 2 fingers and looked up at the clever ceiling with professional respect. "Someone's thought this through," she said. "Good." They went on. The second torch flirted with violet at its edges and made a seam in the wall look a finger's width open. Eliza's pupils widened to drink the light. "What's that?" she asked. Knowing, "A trick," Cobb said. And then, because he wanted to be generous, added, A good one? Behind them, the scratching by the wainscot pebble set up its very small argument with the air. Thomas swore gently under his breath. He had the language of a man who worked with dough and burned fingers rather than swords and saddle girths. Hush, Martyr said, not unkindly. You'll scare the boys. At the long corridor. The air thickened in a seam so modest you could doubt it. Eliza did not feel that she said. Cheek turned into the almost draft. Eyes bright. Cobb and Finn claimed not to, then decided they did. Above them, a helm on a pole breathed for the first time, or seemed to. It turned its brow a trifle, as if a neck had remembered its hinge. Finn stumbled, then straightened into bravado so quickly that the stumble looked like a choice. A floating blade revolved with the measured slowness of a clock that had mislaid the hour. It knocked gently against its neighbor, a nudge, a clink, and Thomas ducked as if the metal had opinions about his hat. Oi, he scolded the plank. Eliza reached out and stopped her hand an inch shy, smiling in a way that said she knew where the thread would be and refused to ruin the illusion. Don't touch, Martyr reminded, because mothers are deputized by the gods to say it even when it's written on a board. She tapped Finn's sleeve to mean the rule applied to him twice. The armor chorus attended no more, no less breathing in different measures like beasts at rest. A gauntlet flexed, a breastplate lifted and settled as if it had lungs behind it. Jericho was nowhere and everywhere, her chalk marks guiding her from seam to slitted curtain to the perch over their heads where a whisper descends like a blessing or the opposite of one. Hello? Dear hearts, she breathed, barely more than shared air, and every shoulder in the party twitched in unison before the laugh chased the flinch. Cobb smacked Finn's arm the way boys do when gratitude would be too much like surrender. The corridor narrowed to the place Nicholas had prepared. In the green light, the alcove looked like the mouth of a niche where a saint would sulk if the temple had been unkind. Inside stood an armored figure with vine in his joints and some distant story on the hammerhead. The group halted in that tentative way that means no one will admit to being first. Eliza, who reads for a living, leaned in with curiosity you could hang a lantern on. It's very well done, she said. The roots see her breath made a little cloud that the helm seemed to notice. Thomas, by some miracle of marriage, had been braver than he knew. He crept closer with a baker's careful hands. They've made it breathe, he decided. A bellows somewhere, Martyr, whose courage was a domestic thing that wore an apron, planted herself squarely between the boys and the statue. All right, she announced to the air. We see you? Nicholas waited until he felt all their breaths gathered in his private chapel of sound, 5 heartbeats and the extra half for Eliza's whisper. Then he stepped out of the stillness by the width of a foot and brought the hammer to the shield. The cave took the sound in both arms and gave it back like weather. Martyr's shriek came first clear, honest, immediately followed by a laugh so loud it popped the tension like a cork. Thomas staggered backward into Finn, who went down on his heels with a clatter and came up grinning to declare he had meant to sit. Cobb lost his hat and his dignity in the same instant and retrieved both with practice. Eliza, bless her tilted head, stood and stared with solemn wonder as if recognizing a line in a book she loves. The helm turned a fraction toward her. That would be a story she'd keep. Nicholas made no second a strike. He lowered the hammer with ceremony, the way one would lower a cross after blessing a field. He let their laughter happen to them, while his breathing slowed inside the cave of his helm. On, Martyr said, righting herself and her men with a stern look that contained pride. We are not the sort to camp in a corridor. They moved, a single animal again, toward the room that had once been a goblin throne and was now an altar for an idea. Bink had tuned the finale to the heat of a body count. The lid opened as they entered, not before. The glow was redder than coals and slower than dawn. Dust rose into air that did not have sun. The pupil darkened from smoke to velvet. Thomas found the hand he married. It found him back. Cobb said something about eyes in the mill at night, and then shut his mouth because the room asked for it. Finn, who had been loudest, quieted by imitation. Eliza's mouse went to a small O that would shame no one. The old crates held their scrap of sailcloths with a dignity beyond their station. The grind that followed was the sound of a stone performing patience. It found the back of the neck and rested there with a light hand. No one screamed in the grand way. They all made the small noises people make when a thing they thought was pretend decides to look at them. Bink stood just out of sight and felt for the cue to close. When backs turned and the first two shoulders aligned with the exit, the lid drooped with the faintest suggestion of lashes. The room exhaled. The group did too, laughing again in a new key. The embarrassment of pleasure that is one of civilization's safest gifts. The last corridor carried them like a gentle canal. Pebbles murmured at their ankles. A torch learned gold again so their eyes would remember home. The opt-out door sat to the left with its red chalk glints. Just in case. No one needed it this time, but it shone like mercy. At the mouth, fog pooled with the orderliness of theater. Bink waited with his ledger and his smile that meant both thank you and wasn't it grand to be brave? He handed Martyr a token, a scrap of paper stamped with the little eye that had crept onto the poster for bragging rights. He said gravely, she took it like a medal. Thomas touched his own chest as if checking his heart had stayed. Next group, please. Bink called lightly. His voice went down the line and came back gilded. The rope slid its knot. Boots shuffled in the way boots do when fear and appetite share a plate. In the side. Nicholas reset his breathing and found the alcove's stillness waiting for him like a pew. Jericho melted through a seam and took a new perch above the second curve. A grace note saved for different ears. The torches lifted their color again, patient as teachers. 5 silhouettes became 5 people at the threshold. The cave held its breath. The night, which had been pretending to be wind and leaves and ordinary October, consented to become a story. They came as if called by some old drum under the hill shoemakers with their aprons still on. Mill boys sugared with flour, women who had put down mending for an hour, elders who dressed dignity in good coats, children craning like sunflowers. The second party arrived loud, 6 men from the Farmers' Guild, whose courage had been brined in ale. They stomped into the fog like a small army, slapping each other's shoulders with the gallantry of the inevitable. Color tricks and broomstrings, declared Ruddy Parsons, a man whose opinions preferred volume to evidence. I've seen darker cellars. The first torch heard him and went gold to mineral green with saintly patience. When the wall groaned its soft hinge sigh, Ruddy's posture remembered a smaller, truer shape. They laughed at him with the loyalty of friends, then clung to one another anyway when Jericho's net lowered like a tired ghost and kissed their collars. She dropped from a ledge 2 chambers later, no shriek. Only the heat of a whisper at ear height, and the guild's bravest made a sound like a kettle finding boil. They emerged into night chastened as boys caught a steeple climbing, and bought cider for each other in penance, each retelling more lavish than the last. A knot of teenage girls came next, 5 in a chain, hands linked and chins up, the way people hold fast when they mean to be brave with witnesses. They marched the runner as if it were a palace carpet, praised the torches with theatrical scorn, and then at the floating blade that turned with unhelpful indifference, squeezed together so tight, the chain became one creature with 10 legs. Don't run. The frontmost commanded herself, which of course meant they trotted, giggling the giggle that is 2/3 terror and 1/3 triumph in the shrine room. When the lid opened on its slow red and the grind like stone remembering a song filled the roof, all 5 went quiet at once, like geese that have seen a shadow pass. The whisper of awe many people pretend never escapes them left their throats anyway. They came out flushed and loud and mortally offended at their own delight. Again, one said, then blushed for having wanted anything twice. A cluster of elders followed under the bailiff's escort, Hendrik in his best coat, Ledger under his arm as if the cave might require an audit. He nodded to Bink as if passing a bylaw. He accepted the rules like a man receiving minutes. The color shift earned him a thin smile of approval that he tried to hide. The groan of the first pebble displeased him philosophically. He managed to praise rope placement and fault the fog for dampening shoe leather in the same breath. Nicholas waited in his alcove until the exact moment the magistrate of beans and bylaws leaned in to pronounce the statue serviceable. Hammer met shield, the cave offered thunder, Hendrik's shriek hatched from his throat and took flight a pure, clear treble unburdened by decorum. He slapped his own chest as if restarting a clock, then barked a laugh he did not know he had in him. He pretended to scowl at exit, but there was a red place at his cheekbones that did not belong to anger. Later, he would overpay for cider and not notice. After them, the newlyweds, Marcus and Helen Richmond, still all edges smoothed by honeymooning. 2 people for whom even rain seems staged. They held hands as if it were a sacrament. Each agreeable outrage in the cave gave them another reason to draw nearer. When Jericho breathed a greeting from a seam above, Helen startled into Marcus's shoulder and then laughed like a bell struck once. Warmly, he set his jaw theatrically at the floating blade, positioning himself between danger and his bride with a gallantry that made Jericho grin behind her paint. Nicholas's thunder sent them arm in arm into the shrine, where they stood still as if at a chapel window and received the eyes a slow regard with the kind of reverence that makes even illusions behave. They came out giddy, practicing bravery by kissing in the fog. The montage lengthened into an evening a seamstress who tisked at the net's stitching while also flinching under it, a cooper who attempted to reason with a helmet, 3 boys who swaggered in like raiders and reassembled themselves as choir boys the instant a gauntlet flexed, 2 very small cousins who marched solemnly through the first corridor, repeating, Stay left. Follow red. Nothing keeps you. As if reciting a holy creed. A pair of widowers walked slow and left slower, looping the rules around their arms like shawls. At the door, Pink stamped the little eye on hands and scraps of paper, a harmless brand for braggarts. People displayed it like witness marks from a just trial. Between groups, the cave rested the way a bell rests between rings. Jericho slid down from a perch. Face paint smudged into something less polished and more eldritch, and leaned her horns on Nicholas's pauldron as if to cool them. I made the bailiff squeal. She reported with the joy of a child who has learned a new whistle, a clean one too. He's going to pretend we taxed him. He'll sleep like a spoon. Nicholas lifted the helm long enough to remember his own face. His hair clung to his brow. His grin was the sort bards file away for endings. Martyr Greenleaf thanked me with her eyes, he said, which in his private lexicon was the equal of a medal. He flexed his fingers, shook out the hammer arm, and confessed. Like a man to his confessor, I'm having fun. Bink arrived in a fizz of ledger and delight, his robes rustling with their private weather. 93 through, he said, showing his tidy columns as if they were the gospel. A few turned back at the opt-out Jericho's lads, guided like angels, and a dozen asked for second turns, and were sent to the end as justice demands. The line reaches the first bend in the path. The cider barrel is doing holy work. Also, Hendrik paid with a gold he didn't miscount. I witnessed it. Take a breath, Jericho ordered fondly. You're turning purple. I cannot, Pink said, already turning to go, because the lantern on the right twitches, and I wish to frown it into obedience. They returned to their stations. The night returned to its rhythm. Rain began with manners, as if asking permission to add itself to the play. The first drops ticked the beech leaves, then the leaves answered with hushes. People drew their cloaks up and leaned into the lantern light that refused to flutter. The fog at the mouth thickened by a fraction, scented darker now peat, and rosemary deepened to something like furrow. The queue looked more beautiful in rain faces glowed. Breath became visible again. Even the bored learned to look like saints. The boys who had mocked earlier stood with their arms around each other's shoulders a little tighter, because wet makes comradeship honest. Inside, rain sweetened every effect. The groans traveled farther, the helm's small turn read larger. Drops learned to tap out tiny polyrhythms on iron rim. Someone shrieked at their own reflection in a damp patch, and then laughed as if delighted to find they possessed a voice. Jericho's whisper picked up a thread of water sound and wore it like jewelry. Nicholas's single thunder felt older in rain, as if borrowed from weather in the shrine room. A bead ran down the edge of the chalked circle and made the eye seem to weep exactly once. Bink did not plan it. He bowed to it anyway, a craftsman acknowledging when the world chooses to collaborate. In the line, the village performed the other half of the spectacle, the listening. People narrated their own courage to the ones behind them, offering advice no one needed and taking comfort from the sound of their own confidence. A grandmother explained to a child how to breathe when you want to run. A brother gave his sister permission to hold his sleeve without commentary. A man with a reputation for vinegar produced 2 boiled sweets and pressed them into palms before his turn. Goethe's lads moved in the wet like practiced ferrymen, reciting the rules in a kindly drone that turned them into a lullaby. Once, a bellow rose near the back and fizzled before it found words. A lantern marshal had put a hand on a shoulder and reminded a man without embarrassment that lines are communities and communities are gentler than weather between the 6th and 7th hour. Jericho trotted to the alcove with a grin that had not learned restraint. "We have critics," she reported. "2 elders at the flagon are parsing which sheker was best. They disagree so politely I nearly wept." "Which did they choose?" Nicholas asked, tightening a strap. "The torch that thinks in colors," she said, casting Bink a look he would have framed if he'd seen it, "and the statue, second only because one of them swears her neighbor fainted decorously. I think the neighbor is lying, but I support her narrative. Let them argue." Nicholas said, "Arguments are warmth." He took his place again. The next party arrived at the edge of his vision, a cooper's apprentice, the midwife with wrists like willow, 2 lads from the quarry, old Mossbach himself for a second pass, beard damp, eyes the kind of bright you see after tears. The hammer rose, the hammer fell, thunder did its faithful work. When the eye looked down on that group a room later, Mossbach took off his cap without being told. "Evening," he said to it, "rural as bread." The eye did not answer, which is its way of being polite. By the time the bell in the square muttered a late hour into the damp, the rope still held 2 more knots of courage. Bink's ledger had taken on a festive density of tallies. Jericho's paint had run to a new character, less demon, more storm. Nicholas's arms ached and his breath had learned a companionable pace with the cavies through it all. The village moved like a creature with many legs that had found its gate enter. Breathe, startle, laugh, exit, talk. Coins chimed the chest without shame. Somewhere down the path, a fiddler struck up a tune under the inn awning, the thin kind you hum when your heart needs a polite place to stand, and over every arrival and departure lay the weather's kind conspiracy rain, steady enough to make the lanterns look brave, never so fierce as to offend. It quilted the evening, tucking in edges that might have fluttered. If anyone had asked the cave for a benediction, it would have offered exactly this fear portioned like a fair slice, laughter rising like steam, a line that behaves, and rain that keeps the world close. Midnight came in the old way by forgetting to be evening and simply becoming the hour when breath hangs and talk shortens. The bell in the square tried a note, thought better of it, and let the rain keep time. The queue had thinned to the sort of people who will wait in any weather for a thing they want to tell about later. One last cluster shuffled in their cloaks, steaming gently like horses after a pull. Bink lifted his lantern that wasn't from the gate and gave them the promise one more time, soft with use now, stay with your group, follow the lit path. If you wish to leave early, step left and follow the red marks out. Some things may seem to touch you, nothing will keep you. He bowed them into the fog and sat back, hands on the chest as if warming them at a hearth. Inside, the cave did what they had taught it to do. Jericho let the net sigh, still tender with rain, an old curtain learning a new part. The wall offered its hinge breath. The floating blade made its lazy orbit as if time were a hobby. Nicholas's alcove received the last 5 with a patience that felt like blessing. His breath and the cave's breath had long since kept each other company. He let their paws ripen, then brought hammer to shield with the courtesy thunder gives hills. They ran in the right key, laughter catching their heels a heartbeat later. At the shrine, the lid lifted to it a slow red, and the grind arrived as modestly as ever. Someone whispered, "Hush," and the room obliged. Outside, the line had gone to a drip. A pair of lads wandered up, hopeful, and were told, kindly, to come tomorrow in a world where tomorrow did not include All Hallows, but the kindness made it taste better. Goethe's marshals stamped their feet and drank the last of the cider, cheeks lit with lantern glow. Bink counted knots, then unlooped the last one and hung the rope neat, as if tidiness could anchor an evening so it wouldn't blow away. When the final 5 spilled from the mouth, cheeks bright, hair beaded, a small chorus of again rose and dissolved into good-natured groans as Bink lifted both palms like a priest closing a rite. "That's it, friends. We're closed for the night. Thank you for your brave hearts." The disappointed O drifted down the path, then turned itself into applause real, uneven, village applause that says both thank you and we're relieved we survived ourselves. Nicholas stepped from the alcove and took off the helm. The air slapped him with its cold kindness. Sweat ran from his temple and became part of the cave. He stood a moment to let the stillness seep out of his bones, then leaned the hammer by the wall like a tired flag. Jericho slid out of a crevice, paint run to a new personality, horns glinting as if they had learned rain. She puffed a breath into her palms and laughed at how the fog took it. "We made a night," she said. Surprised and not, they walked the corridor together toward the entrance, calling a small goodnight to pebbles and blades as if they were stagehands striking a set. Bink waited on his stool with ledger open and that careful posture he used when minding more than coin. The chest beside him, Goethe's loan with the honest scar on the rim, was not just full. It had become something like a small, square promise. Gold lay in the top layer like leaves that had decided to shine. Silver nested in the corners with professional modesty. Copper had done what copper does, filled gaps, held the rest together, made itself necessary. Bink looked up at them and forgot to turn off the little glamour on his eyes. They glowed milk white, which made him seem simultaneously haunted and delighted. He blinked, laughed at himself, and pushed the glow away with 2 fingers. Tally Nicholas asked, a word he had said 100 times about rations, and never with this particular tremor. Bink lifted the sheet he'd been marking columns of hatch marks so tidy they could march. 2. He stopped to savor the syllables. 150. He could not help it. Little fireworks, stitched from nothing to nothing, sprang off his fingertips and singed the edge of the page. He yelped, patted it out, and beamed so fiercely his face looked younger. Jericho let out a whistle that tried to be low and failed. 250, she repeated, making sure the night heard. From fog and pebbles and a hammer strike, from rules spoken like a lullaby, she crouched by the chest and dipped a hand to the second layer of coin with the respect a priest gives relics. Nicholas High Forge. We have invented honest prosperity. Nicholas could not speak for a beat. In his head, numbers turned themselves into bread, oil, wax, thread, the quiet miracle of rent paid early, the extravagant thought of commissioning a proper repair on the chinked pauldron. 250. In a month of escort fees and goblin bounties and thin purses, they'd tripled this number in stories, but never in metal. He thought of the Academy's promised glory, righteous work, the satisfaction of the right, and felt none of it diminished by this new arithmetic. If anything, the scales had steadied. They carried the chest inside to the first chamber, away from the wet, and closed the gate shelf Bink had rigged against accidents. The torches, left to their own colors, went on listening. Rain stitched the woods with its patient needle. The three of them sat on the broad sill where fog did not quite reach, as if a house had grown a front step. For a minute, no one felt the need to narrate. The quiet had changed flavor, less exhaustion, more completion. Jericho broke it with a marveling sound. "Did you hear them leaving?" she asked, softer than her paint suggested she could be. They talked about themselves like company they'd just met and liked. "I heard," Bink said, "a grandmother teaching a boy how to breathe through the part that scares you. Two widowers agreeing it was pleasant to be startled and not also bereaved. The bailiff making up a complicated reason he shrieked. His smile drifted into something gentler than triumph. We moved them without moving them. That's new." Nicholas looked down the corridor where his alcove had lived him all evening. He had turned his breath into a metronome for other people's courage. That felt like liturgy of a sort without a sacrament. With kindness, they were brave, he said, as if surprised by a conclusion. We didn't sell them humiliation. We sold them their own nerve, returned in better wrapping. Jericho's tail made its idle S on the stone, unthreatening as a ribbon. "This is civic work," she said. "Matter of fact, different from cleaning out a den, and no less. You knit a village by giving it one story to wear on the same night." Bink made a small professorial hum, pleased to hear the thesis he would have offered arrive from another mouth. "Festivals are bridges," he answered. "You build them so the dark months don't separate people more than weather requires." He gestured toward the pot at the door, still exhaling the last of its mist like a tired kettle. "If you can measure happiness by esteem and rumor, we've done measurable good." The chest sat between them, humming in its metal way. Jericho plucked a coin of copper and spun it on the sill. It wobbled, corrected, spun true. "You know," she said, "lied on purpose. A younger me would be halfway to the border with this box and a grin. Older me thinks about blankets and boots for the boys who stood in the rain for strangers, about paying Aldis on time next time, mostly for the smugness, about buying Goethe's lads gloves that fit." She captured the coin and flicked it back into the chest, a neat little ping-like punctuation. Nicholas leaned his head back against a stone and closed his eyes. The damp in his hair cooled and felt like water after a march. He thought of the academy again, of the bards they had teased, the pretty voices, the tricksy feet, and felt a flush of apology he would deliver eventually, perhaps in a letter to his sister. "They told us," he murmured, a little bemused, "that delight distracts from duty. I think delight steadies it." He opened his eyes to find Jericho watching him with that look she got when he surprised her in ways that made her pretend not to be touched. "I'm putting that on a poster," she said. Bink, who had never met a quill he didn't suspect might be listening, wrote the phrase on the back of the tally sheet and drew a tiny torch beside it, with a halo that managed not to look pious. Then, conspiratorial, he looked toward the entrance where Night stayed and lowered his voice. If we wanted to, he said, we could make a second night. Not All Hallows proper, but for those who missed it. No, Nicholas said, not stern, simply certain. We don't cheapen it with greed, we leave them wanting a year. He surprised himself with how confident it felt to leave coin on the table. And we sleep. Jericho agreed without argument, which was a sign of the rightness of the thing more than the hour. And tomorrow we eat ridiculous breakfast and argue about winter. Bink glanced at the eye of his little stamped tokens, scattered like seeds on the sill. Winter, he repeated, privately alight. Lights that move without wind, snow that behaves indoors, stories that walk. He shook himself free of the future and pressed the chest's lid down with both hands. But for tonight, close, Nicholas said, and he stood and did the practical end of magic. He checked the ash buckets, tucked the blankets, smothered the last charmed flame with a word that thanked it, and hung the opt-out cloth back true, because mercy deserves tidiness. Jericho unwound the red-knotted twine from the queue rope and coiled it like a rosary. Bink collected the signboard and slid the spare copy back into his sleeve. Safe as a creed. Outside, rain made a field of silvery beads on the beech leaves, and the path had become a quiet river of mud that would tell the morning where courage had queued. The lanterns nodded, tireless. Down the track, a handful of revelers still stood under the flagon's awning, telling each other the same story with different hands. Goethe, who could see in the dark better than anyone admitted, raised a cup toward the trees and went back to supervising the world. They set the chest on the handcart and, because it was heavy in a way that felt good, each took a handle. The woods walked with them, light dropping in beads from leaf tips, fog settling to ankle height like a tame thing. Bink conjured 3 fireflies to keep them company and then dismissed them with thanks. As if not to overdo the wonder, Jericho's tail looped lazily. Nicholas whistled a bar of an old march that sounded less martial, now more like a tune you hum when you have somewhere warm to go. At the edge of the square, they paused without planning to. Milhaven slept the way honest villages do, doors barred, cats deciding whose roof to borrow. One window still bright where someone stitched. The bell tower kept its peace. The posters they'd hung earlier in the day hung wet and honorable. The chest sat solid between their hands. Bink looked from the gold glinting in the seam to the dark windows, and then to the 2 people who had forged a new kind of work with him, and said, as if reading minutes into the record, "We did more than earn." Nicholas nodded. "We held the dark at the door," he said, and did not mean goblins, Jericho, who usually turned anything solemn into a joke before it could bite. Let this one stand a heartbeat. Then she grinned, and, she said, thumbing rain from the edge of her horn, "We made the bailiff a squeal." They laughed, because joy deserves its own ceremony, and rolled the cart toward the flagon and beds that would accept them like forgiveness. Morning arrived with that washed look towns wear the day after they've kept themselves up past sense-gooders still glittering. Doorsteps clean in the way rain cleans. A pleasant ache in the west street, as if the cobbles had laughed too. They slept until Goethe's notion of mercy noon and a pan the size of a shield slammed on the kitchen table, then stumbled to breakfast to find that news had outrun sleep. Every table was telling the story as if they had been the only ones to live it. The little stamped eyes Bink had handed out rode jacket cuffs and hat bands like campaign pins. They were polishing the last of Goethe's ridiculous breakfast eggs in a sizzle. Bread that remembered ovens, jam that insisted on summer when a polite cough arrived at their elbows. Hendrik Bramble, bailiff, ledger general, looked curiously less pinched by daylight. Behind him came a deputation that would have made a parish meeting proud old mossback, with last night's damp still silvering his beard. 2 councillors, Nichols, had only seen astern, Goethe herself, apron like a banner, and 3 citizens who had appointed themselves witnesses because that is a town's first right. Rain had parted their hair neatly. Determination had combed the rest. Master Highforge, Miss Jericho, Master Burnside. Hendrik inclined his head in a way that would have creaked yesterday. On behalf of the council, he began, and he cleared his throat, glanced at Mossbach's shining face, the wider citizenry. We wish to commend, whatever that was, entertainment, Goethe supplied, planting her hands on the table with the satisfaction of a field at harvest, and order, both together, rare as hen's teeth and twice as useful. Precisely, Hendrik said. Grateful for nouns, he produced a notebook whose corners had known weather and flipped to a page where he had made columns. Last night brought trade to the flagon and to every stall girl with a kettle. It filled our square with people who then went home pleased, which is an unusual municipal outcome. Yet he gave up on prose and let himself smile. It squeaked. A part of me I had forgotten could squeak. Jericho leaned back in her chair as if presented with a mark she meant to bargain down to the bone. You've come to deny us permits, she guessed, in the tone of a person bracing for bureaucracy. Quite the opposite. Hendrik, who had slept on the idea and found it improved by bedding, spread his hands. What if you stayed at forever as vagrants in residence? He added before the paladin's shoulders could stiffen. But in contract, seasonal engagements, the winter feast, what some insist on naming winter's splendor, then, well, a spring blossom, midsummer, harvest's eve again. If the gods continue to humor us, the council would draw up terms, modest fees for square use, a percentage tithe to cover cleaning and marshals. In return, we handle signage permissions, crowd patrol, and certain discouragements of freelance imitators, copycats, Goethe translated, with a look that promised a private conversation with any such. Mossbach bobbed, and the children, bless them, will stop nagging me for lanterns that do tricks. You'll give them tricks on purpose. One counselor, a woman with pins bristling from her sleeves as if she collected tasks, chimed in. We could build you better fixtures, rackets that won't drop a coal if the wind sneezes. I can fetch you an offcut of a sailcloth to replace that thing you've draped on the crates. It's got holes large enough for mice to walk through in their Sunday best. Bink's eyes had gone to that inward bright place that meant he was drawing maps on a part of the world no one else could see. An actual venue, he murmured, a place that knows it's a theater when the fields sleep. We could rig lines for lanterns that move gently without tangling, stones pre-tuned for the kind of sigh that expresses wonder instead of mildew. Hendrik, encouraged, pressed on to the sentence his ledger had been practicing. We propose a percentage. You keep most? Naturally. He tried out the word and seemed surprised at how much he meant it. The village's share modest, 10%, he ventured, as if confessing a vice. Jericho, who liked numbers when they were real and not attitude, flicked a glance at Nicholas, their conscience and calculator both, and then back. 10, she said slowly. Covers marshals and permits, cleans the square, and buys gloves for those lads when frost bites. But you'll not nick us with hidden fees. Hendrik, no additional assessments because your cousin wants a new hat. Goethe snorted so loudly a spoon jumped. No cousin of his will want a hat while I breathe. Transparent accounts, Nicholas added, the Justicar's cadences returning out of habit. A ledger we can read line by line, we tally nightly, then weekly, and we insist on the same strictness about safety as we kept last night. Hendrik nodded too vigorously for a man usually so careful with agreement. Rules posted, marshals briefed, exits marked, blankets and buckets. The square cleared of carts on event nights, the bell kept on a generous rope in case a tone needs a striking. Old Mossbach, who had been fretting with his cap, burst into proposal with the unstoppable sincerity of a man whose fields have made him philosophical. Lights, he said, make them dance for winter's splendor, and snow, children who've never seen it proper should have a drift to kick indoors. My Ruth always wanted ice that sang. Can you do ice that sings? Not that sings, Pink said. Ernest, but that hums as you pass, so you feel the note in your ribs. He turned to Nicholas and Jericho, unable to hold the ideas in his sleeves any longer. Imagine the square dressed in lanterns that dim and brighten as people tell stories under them, strings of light that refuse to tangle because I have bribed them with better physics, a ring of snow that melts to nothing at dawn and leaves no puddle, stories projected on shop fronts that walk alongside you while you walk, telling you how your grandparents met without naming names. Games, Jericho added, already inventing revenue with the grace of breathing. Knifeless, knife-throwing bean bags to spare scandal, but will make them look sharp from 20 paces. Lock-picking races on boards practice sets. No one's door learns our tricks. Obstacle courses that are mostly balance and pride. Prizes that glow for an hour and then choose to be ordinary for the sake of modesty. Hendrik's counselors exchanged looks that tried to be stern and failed. Goethe slapped the table once to punctuate approval, and the stalls, she declared, hot buns, pot pies, a vat of chocolate thick enough to mend feuds. I'll tap a cask for wassail, even if the temple grumbles. Lantern walks at the end, so the littles go home soothed. Nicholas, who kept an inner abacus for harm, counted exits in his head as they talked. Winter brought different risks, frost slick, close quarters, candles that think themselves clever. He ran the sums anyway and found no fault he did not know how to mend. We'll do it if we can write the rules first, he said at last, quiet but certain. Rules for arriving and leaving. Rules for how many bodies a square can hold without forgetting to be kind. Rules for fire and the illusion of it. And we name a maximum if the line snakes to the mill. We stop and promise another night next year rather than push until someone slips. Jericho cocked her head at him and smiled with that mixture of fondness and mischief he earned on days he sounded like a walking oath. and we price it fair. She said, no shilling the poor for delight. We keep a jar at the gate for those who can't pay, but came for the look of the thing. Last night made enough to justify hospitality. Hendrik, who had probably expected arguments sharper than these, seized the moment before it changed its mind. Then you accept, he asked, pen at the ready as if signatures might evaporate in humid air. Nicholas looked from the bailiff to the faces behind him, the farmer who would be telling this in 3 different versions by supper, the counselor with pins who'd build them brackets as if carving saints, Goethe, whose eyes had become the town's temporary crest, Bink, vibrating at a frequency that made the spoon quiver, Jericho, whose tail had looped twice around her chair rung. The tell he could read now like handwriting. He was surprised to realize there wasn't a great decision to make. The choice had arrived at the mouth of the cave last night and walked out with them. We'd be fools to pass it up, he said simply. Hendrik exhaled a laugh that tried to be dignified and failed halfway, which helped. Mossbach wiped his eyes with his cap as if the future were a wind. Goethe clapped once and declared the flagon's back room a negotiating chamber, a place with a long table and the right number of chairs, and a stubborn window that would be forgiven because it let in winter sun. We'll write it down, she said, in words even Hendrik's cousin can understand. They spend the next hour doing the unromantic work that keeps romance from tripping percentages in neat columns, dates that gave the square time to recover, a list of what the village would provide, ladders, marshals, a covered cart for equipment, and what the trio would bring at design, staff training, the invisible infrastructure of attention. Jericho bargained like a riverboat, praise first, price second. Long silences before agreeing that taught the bailiff a new respect for silence. Bink slid a clause in about creative control that made the counselors blink and then nod as if they had always planned to let the artists lead. Nicholas made sure no harm wasn't just implied. He wrote the phrase itself into the margin and drew a little box around it until ink dried glossy. When the council rose at last, signatures sitting like tidy geese in a row, the town did a very small cheer. It did it without a trumpet. It did it as people do who have chosen a future and now mean to cook it for supper. The counselors went off muttering about brackets. Mossbach promised pumpkins for whoever wanted to try carving that eye on purpose. Goethe returned to the bar and began ordering flour with the air of a general counting cannon. Hendrik shook each of their hands as if making vows, and then, halfway to the door, turned back with the vestige of the squeak still in him. For the record, he said, sheepish, that was a very clever statue. Nicholas, the man inside the armor who had been a statue for 3 hours straight, bowed with the dignity of a saint who has changed his mind, will make you squeak again at winter's splendor, Jericho promised, merciful and merciless. After the deputation scattered, the 3 of them sat looking at the newly official future. The way people look at a road they used to think was only for others. Bink put both hands on the contract as if steadying a boat. Lanterns that dim in time with stories, he said dreamily. Snow that shivers instead of melts. A short ghost play about the town's own legends, mummers, but kinder. We'll need apprentices to run the ropes. I can train them not to set fire to their eyebrows. Prizes, Jericho said. making a page of ideas on her palm with invisible ink, tokens for courage, ribbons that remember your name for an hour, a puzzle trail for the small ones, a booth where you can confess to a secret fear and have it folded into a paper boat and floated away. Nicholas imagined the square unlatched and dressed for winter, a place where cold meant invitation instead of retreat. The academy had taught him 10 kinds of bravery. He had learned an 11th last night, the kind a village borrows from itself, when light moves just so, and the rules are kind, and the hammer thunders once, and laughter remembers to arrive on time. "All right," he said, feeling the rightness anchor where worry had lived. "Let's build a season." They did not waste the morning's momentum. Contracts folded into Bink's sleeve like talismans. The three of them spilled into the square with the purposeful days of people who have said yes to something larger than their living and must now pretend they have always known how to do it. Winter's splendor sat 6 weeks away like a bright coin across a table. 6 weeks is an eternity when you are idle, and a thumb's width when you have promised a spectacle. The square itself had opinions. It was old as stone, set in stubborn patterns. A pump with a handle polished by 3 generations of thirst. A bell tower that had been rung for marriages, fires, and one memorable sheep escape. It would have to learn to be a theater. The counselor, with pins in her sleeves, arrived with a coil of chain and a carpenter's grin. "Brackets," she said, as if bestowing a blessing, bolted proper into lintels. No more torches in hands where a sneeze is a sin. She thumped a post with the heel of her hand, pronounced it sound, and set 3 apprentices to auguring holes in the way of women who find joy in hex heads and right angles. Nicholas walked the perimeter with a marshal's eye, counting escape routes as if they were beads. No stalls against the lanes, he told Goethe, who had already staked out the width of her bun table with a string. Leave a cart's width for passing. Sand where feet will wring water from the snow. He had a word with the priest at the temple gate fire to be kept in buckets with lids. Candles in globes that refused to gutter into cloth. The bell rope blessed for use as a signal and not a sermon. He wrote the rules on a placard with the same hand he'd used to copy oaths as a novice. Arrive kindly. Move as if your neighbor were kin. If you feel unsteady, tell a marshal, no open flames outside the hearth circle. Leave room for laughter to pass. Jericho collected a flotilla of children by the simple expedient of kneeling at their height and announcing, solemn as a magistrate, that the town had need of mischief helpers. She taught them the art of Q-knot counting, the honor of holding a line without letting it knot itself into nonsense, the thrill of wearing a little ribbon that meant you could fetch a marshal if anyone's fun got too large. She set the taller ones to running practice courses, a low beam to teach balance, a rope to duck, hoops to step through slowly without kicking. The rules were disguised as games before anyone realized it. The square had grown muscle memory. Bink disappeared into a workshop that materialized under the apothecary's awning tables strewn with wire, glass globes, little gears that clicked like polite teeth. He spoke to light the way bakers speak to dough, pleading and scolding by turns. He tested a string of lanterns that brightened when someone told a story under them and dimmed when the teller tried to cheat with length. He bound a hum into a loop of crystal so that when the loop was chilled, it sang a note you could feel in the ribs, a winter hymn with no words. He charmed papered snow to fall and then change its mind just before landing, dissolving mid-air into the satisfied sigh of something that had never meant to be wet. They piloted setbacks like sailors. On the third afternoon, a line of lanterns thought themselves clever and knotted into a braid, while Bink's head was turned. Jericho climbed the post like an arboreal fox and, laughing, teased the snarl apart with fingers that had picked locks and untangled worse. One earliest snow test sent a sheet of frost skittering toward the pump. Nicholas skidded, swore in a way that would not shame a paladin, and fetched sand enough to persuade the square not to learn skating by accident. A bracket bolt refused to bite. The counselor with the pins thumped it again and declared, "Wrong thread," as if cursing lineage, then swapped it with a conspiratorial wink and the proper screw that submitted as good hardware should. Word of the work traveled faster than a cart can rattle. Roadside hedges shared the news with the starlings. Neighbors leaned on brooms and offered opinions that were, unhelpfully, not wrong. Eliza Thornberry emerged from the apothecary with a coil of a ribbon and a page where she had drawn proposed routes for a lantern walk. "If we drift the children this way," she said, pointing, "the new mothers can stand under the awning and still see. And if we end by the pump, everyone will remember to drink water between wassail." Bink blessed her with a grin and drafted her into a script of the night. Old Mossbach hauled 2 uncarved pumpkins from a cellar that smelled like earth and pride and asked, almost shy, if they might be made into lanterns that told jokes. "They can groan," Bink said gravely, "but only at puns." They rehearsed in pieces after sundown one evening. While the square was mostly theirs, they hung the first chain of story lanterns and asked Girta to tell the tale of the split tankard. As her words reached the part where the barbarian lifted the axe, the lanterns brightened, then dimmed as she softened on the punchline. "Good," she said, pleased at being conspired with. "I'll train the other tellers to breathe at the commas." The next night, Jericho trialed the prize booth ribbons with a glamour that made your name appear in a neat hand for an hour, then faded like temper. Children queued with the urgent patience of the young, confessed private terrors that involved geese and deep ponds and the possibility of dropping bread in public. She folded each fear into a paper boat, set it in a basin charmed to be a lake, and let the boat drift under the table and vanish into the idea of a sea. Watching the release, a stooped man who had not spoken since his wife's funeral managed a small, foolish smile. "Gone," Jericho told him. "We'll honor it by not speaking of it again." Nicholas ran drills with the new marshals how to smile a line into compliance, how to walk backward with a lantern without becoming a prophecy of collision, how to keep the edges open so that children could be held and not pinched by crowds. He borrowed 3 woolen cloaks from the temple's charity chest and promised to replace them with better. He set them on the backs of benches near the hearth circle with a note pinned in his square hand. "If you're cold, this is yours for an hour." One sharp morning, the square learned to snow. Binga stood at the center with a bowl of crescents carved from some white stone that did not exist for anyone else, blew out a word that was all exhalation and no sound, and the air around him began to fill with flakes. Not the soaking, spiteful kind that capsizes hats, a drift of dry stars that landed on sleeves and kept their points for a breath, then took themselves discreetly away. Children ran in wonder, elders put out palms and caught patience. Jericho tilted her face up, stuck out her tongue, and declared the taste proper like cold bread. She judged, then winked at Nicholas to keep him from crying at the neatness of a small miracle. They ran a dress rehearsal 2 nights before winter's splendor, inviting only enough neighbors to teach the square where to put its weight. The lanterns brightened and dimmed on cue. The humming loop set ribs steady without making anyone think of funerals. The prize booth dispensed courage-like sweets. A single small boy tried to climb a bracket. Jericho plucked him off with a comment about gravity as a jealous friend, and returned him to his blinking father with a ribbon that said, in elegant script, "Remember to hold my hand." Goethe circulated with trays of mugs that fumed hospitality. The bailiff moved through the crowd, writing nothing in his ledger, and, for once, not minding. "Tomorrow will be double this," Nicholas said at the edge of the square, arms folded, fog blooming at his breath. "Triple. If the weather holds its end of the bargain, tomorrow we will remember to eat before dusk," Jericho said, stealing a bun off Goethe's tray and eeling away before a scolding found her. "Hungry thieves make bad ushers." "Tomorrow," Pink murmured, gazing up at the lanterns, "we will ask a town to rehearse joy." They slept, which is a kind of courage before a storm, and woke to a day that had scrubbed its face. The sun made a brief courtesy call and then left the sky to a clean, pewter calm. By mid-afternoon, stalls were dressed. The story lanterns tested, the snowstones hiding in their bowl like moons. Nicholas posted the placards himself, one at each entrance to the square, then walked the circuit twice more because the habit of guarding does not take a holiday just because the calendar requests it. Jericho stationed her mischief helpers at their posts, tying each ribbon with a flourish and a whispered instruction. "See that woman with the red shawl if she looks lost. Offer an arm. You don't need permission to be kind." Bink tuned the hum in the ice loop a hair lower so it would sit in the belly, not the teeth. Then practiced telling a silly story into the lanterns and making them laugh in light. Dusk arrived as if it had read the schedule. The bell tolled once, then twice. A signal agreed between temple and tavern that tonight the square belonged to both. Lanterns took their first breath in dim, then out bright. The first family entered hand in hand, boots nude for the occasion, cheeks prepared for wonder. The snow hung for a heartbeat and then politely introduced itself. Goethe's kettle approved of its own esteem. Somewhere near the edge, Hendrik set a modest box for donations for blankets. He announced, careful to meet Nicholas's eye. He didn't need to say the rest. None of this had ever only been about coin. The three of them stood a moment at the square's lip and let themselves look. It was not a cave, not a dungeon, not even quite a stage. It was a village dressed in the suggestion that ordinary could be coaxed into exquisite without lying. Nicholas felt his chest loosen, felt duty and delight clasp hands like people reconciled. Jericho's tail made a lazy question mark and then straightened, the way her questions do when they've found answers worth keeping. Pink whispered something to the light that sounded like please and thank you in the same breath. "All right then," Jericho said, tilting her chin toward the gate where the first cluster waited with shy excitement. "Let's make winter behave." Nicholas nodded to a marshal who nodded to a lantern, which brightened in reply. Bink raised a hand and began the first story. The esquire leaned in. The season came forward like a friend at the door. Winter's splendor lifted its curtain, not with trumpets, but with the soft intake of 100 breaths. Lanterns along the eaves brightened as Bink's first story unspooled how an old miller tricked a blizzard by inviting it in for tea and boredom. The lights laughed in answer, dimming at his pauses, flaring at his slyest verbs. Snow remembered its manners and fell as dry as stars, settling on his sleeves like soft punctuation before choosing to vanish at the last instant as if reluctant to be puddles. Along the square's rim, Jericho's mischief, helpers took their posts with ribbons on their sleeves and a seriousness that made grown men stand straighter. Goethe's kettle declared itself essential. The square, taught over weeks to move like a single creature with courtesy, performed as if it had rehearsed for years. A lantern marshal walked backward with an easy gait and a bell at his hip that chimed only when comfort required announcing itself. The prize booth blushed with ribbons. Names appeared in neat hand, then faded at the hour as promised enough magic to keep children from arguing. Not so much that adults felt the world had been rewritten without their consent. Jericho ran the confessional basin with the gravity of a small priest, folding geese and deep pond fears into paper boats that slipped away beneath the table toward some agreed-upon sea. The astute widower returned with a grandchild and didn't need a ribbon this time. He showed the boy how to breathe when your throat tries to become a fist by the pump. Old mossbags joke lanterns groaned theatrically at puns and refused to perform for metaphors. Lowest common denominator, Bink observed with affection. He tuned the humming ice loop lower, felt the note settle not in teeth but in ribs, and a step back as a ring of children discovered the simple miracle of making footprints that did not melt. The counselor with pins patrolled her brackets with proprietary pride, thumping posts with a glove and nodding like a general greeting artillery. Nicholas did his preferred work unnoticed until needed. The placards "Arrive kindly," "Move as if your neighbor were kin" gleamed from their posts. He read them under his breath as he walked. A man who remembered his oaths by walking them. Twice he eased a knot of bodies into a ribbon again with 2 sentences and a smile. Once he reached a hand behind a boy who stumbled while looking up. The hand landed on a shoulder and turned a fall into a dance step. He counted exits the way other men count blessings, and found each one exactly where they had left it. When the priest ambled by with a reluctant grin and a candle in a globe, Nicholas inclined his head. "It holds," he said quietly. The priest, who had once feared the esquire would treat play as sacrilege, looked at lantern light painting kind faces and replied, "Some prayers are said with good planning." Bink spun, as only a small wizards can spin, from a storied fixture to small emergency. A line of lanterns tried to teach themselves cat's cradles again. Jericho was halfway up the post before he finished an oath, fingers unpuzzling the knot with lockpicker calm. A patch of ornamental frost escaped toward the pump. Nicholas sanded it until friction remembered itself and pressed the boy's hand around a hot mug. At one corner, The lanterns dimmed in shy solidarity as an elderly couple waltzed in place to the drum of their own feet. The lights remembered to brighten at the bow. All evening, the donation box under Hendrik's modest sign for blankets filled with coins that clinked their intentions. The bailiff looked briefly embarrassed by how much he loved the sound. He did not attempt to calculate aloud, which was mercy on everyone present. Instead, he carried logs, repeated the rules with pastoral care, and learned to say thank you as if the words had always lived easily in his mouth. When the counselors paused to warm their hands at Gerta's stall, they argued about whether lantern strings should cross the square diagonally next time for better sightlines, and if the hum ought to be tuned to F for neighborly reasons. For once, all their arguments were about improvement rather than permission. As the evening settled into its second hour, and the lanterns found their lungs, Bink drew a small crowd near the story ring and unveiled a toy he had made from scraps and Delight a book that drifted just above his palms, pages turning themselves as he read, projecting brief, moving silhouettes on a hanging sheet. They were local myths reimagined, how the bell learned its tone in a storm, how the beach decided to bend so lovers could walk under it, how a fox once stole a baker's bun and returned it a year later as a tray of buns. The silhouettes bowed occasionally to living spectators. The living bowed back, because politeness costs nothing and makes magic stand longer. Jericho ran the knifeless knife-throwing with an elegant cruelty that taught aim without danger. Beanbags disguised as blades thumped satisfying circles painted on a screen. Small champions received ribbons that glowed for exactly 1 hour and then considered the matter closed. At the lockboards, apprentices raced to open practice shackles as Jericho timed them with a whistle and trenchant commentary. "We teach nimble fingers where to be honest," she said to a skeptical aunt. The woman nodded as if the lesson fit snugly beside mending and pie crust. Around the hearth circle, someone began a carol too early for the calendar and was forgiven. The snow thickened by a polite fraction, and the hum held the square in a gentle chord. Nicholas took his turn at Gerta's kettle, because leadership is sometimes the quiet kind, and ladled wassail with a blessing of dry humor. "This," he said to a teenager who had declared himself above warm drinks and then accepted one, "is what valor tastes like." There was, inevitably, a moment when the night asked to be handled. A gust shouldered through the lane between the cobbler and the apothecary, setting a line of lanterns to tilt and an awning to flap. A child squeaked. 2 dogs decided to locate their opinions. Nicholas raised a hand and made a small, calming circle. The nearest marshal stepped forward, spoke one rule quietly, and the crowd remembered its training a space here. Patience there, laughter to mend the embarrassment. Bink whispered to the lanterns. They straightened. Jericho fetched a rope's end out of nowhere and secured the awning with a knot that would hold through spring out of sheer shame. The moment passed with that special kind of cheer you hear when everyone chooses to be better than weather, close to the end, when cheeks were apple bright and the snowstones had been reduced to a bowl of obedient moons. Bink called the mischief helpers to him and staged a small pageant. The lanterns dimmed as he thanked each ribboned child by name for keeping the square kind. The hum softened to a purr The priest's bell gave one low, contented note. Jericho gave every helper a final ribbon plain cloth, no glamour embroidered with a tiny stitched eye that would not fade, for seeing what needs seeing. She told them. Several children stood 2 inches taller for the rest of the month, which is all any government truly hopes to accomplish. Last cups were served, last stories told. The lanterns, on Bink's word, began their slow breath out toward dark. The snow made its last gallant attempt, and then, with a shared sigh, chose not to become a chore for morning. People lingered as people do when they are reluctant to admit a good thing has ended. The donation box was heavier than Hendrik's arm, and he refused to let anyone else carry it, as if the weight could confess him into the future. When the square had thinned to cats and custodians, the 3 of them stood in the center where the hum had lived and listened to its absence. Work whispered from every corner, brackets to check, cords to coil, stray sweet wrappers to find before the wind made them myth. They did it without complaint, the way people do when they have decided that excellence is a habit rather than an event. Jericho tied the last rope into a hank with her eyes half closed for gaiety. Bink pinched each lantern soft and thanked it. Nicholas walked the placards one more time, not because he distrusted them, but because there is affection in checklists. Hendrik arrived with the blanket funds and a phase he did not know how to wear. "We'll keep the town warm," he said simply, putting the box by Goethe's bench as if tendering a child. "You were right to insist on rules. You were right to charge enough to make it matter. You were right to." He groped for the word and found, to his horror and delight, play. He cleared his throat, bowed stiffly, and departed before Jericho could tease him into laughter again. They walked home the long way, not because they were avoiding sleep, but because there is a right speed at which to put a night away. The square breathed itself into ordinary behind them. The posters that had once been promises were now minutes of a meeting fulfilled. Nicholas looked at his friends and felt the neat satisfaction that arrives when a day's duty and a day's joy agree about the value of the work. Jericho's tail wrote lazy ellipses. Bink conjured a quiet comet the size of a firefly and let it follow them to the flagon, then dismissed it with a pat. At the inn door, where the split tankard sign had become an altar to communal appetite, they paused. 2 nights. Jericho counted, low and pleased, 2 very different nights. Both honest. Bink, who had once believed happiness was mostly a problem for cleverness to solve, looked uncharacteristically solemn. "We build bridges," he said, "between what people think they can bear and what they can, between seasons, between rules and wonder. We did it with rope and words and promise." Nicholas leaned his shoulder against the lintel, tired, content. A man who would sleep the sleep of those who have carried and set down exactly the right number of burdens. "We'll keep doing it," he said. "We'll keep holding the dark at the door. Some nights with thunder, some nights with lanterns." They went into bread, to blankets, to the sort of exhaustion that forgives every ache. Outside, the square returned to being a square and kept, in its stones and brackets and the memory of a hum, the imprint of a town that had practiced bravery together and found it fit. The posters would fade, the brass bells would tarnish, snow would remember itself water, but the story how a village learn to be splendid on a winter night and brave on an autumn one would be told the way all good histories are told, with a hand-warmed cup, a decent laugh, and somebody saying, "Were you there? Did you see?"